What if Harry Potter did not stay in Britain after the war? Voldemort is dead. Hogwarts is broken. The world calls Harry a hero, but Harry feels like a ghost. No more funerals, no more interviews, no more people staring at the boy who lived. So Harry leaves everything behind and vanishes to the rain-soaked town of Forks, Washington. A quiet house, a rusted truck, a place where no one knows his name. But Forks is not as peaceful as it looks. There are vampires in the trees. Evero is already watching. Edward Cullen cannot read Harry's mind. Alice cannot see him clearly. And Harry Potter, who came to Forks to escape monsters, is about to discover that some monsters were waiting for him all along. Hey guys, welcome to the Vampire Harry. Here you will get best Twilight and Harry Potter what-ifs. Subscribe if you are new here. Also set that bell notification to all, so whenever I post the video, you get the notification first. Now, without any further delay, let's dive into this crazy what-if.
Dust hung in the air long after the screaming stopped. It came down through the broken roof of the great hall in slow, gentle veils, the way snow used to fall on the burrow at Christmas. It settled on the long tables, where house elves had once laid out roasted potatoes and treacle tart. It settled on stone, on splintered benches, on the long gray rows of bodies someone had been kind enough to lay out shoulder to shoulder, as if they were only sleeping. Harry stood at the edge of it all and did not move. He had been standing there a long time. People kept brushing past him, kind-eyed and exhausted, putting hands on his shoulder and saying things that did not reach him. Madame Pomfrey had come twice, the second time with a small, unstoppered vial and a tone of voice that meant business. He had drunk what she gave him, and afterward the world had not changed color, and that had felt like a kind of betrayal. He had thought, foolishly, that potions were supposed to make things easier. Voldemort was dead. The body, snake-thin and small in death the way it had not been in life, had been carried away to a side chamber under guard by half a dozen Aurors and 3 goblins and Phileas Flitwick himself, because it would have been too obscene a thing to leave lying in the open. The Death Eaters who had survived the last hour were being marched into a hastily warded antechamber by tearful, fierce-faced fifth years who had grown up too fast and were never going to grow back down again. Outside, somewhere on the lawn, McGonagall was speaking to a centaur in a low voice about graves. Inside, somewhere in the middle of the wreckage, Molly Weasley was sitting on the flagstones with her son's head in her lap, not weeping, not yet, just smoothing his hair as though he were a child of 6 who had fallen asleep on the rug. Harry did not look in that direction. If he looked, he was not sure what he would do. He was tired in a way he had not known a body could be. Not the tiredness of the long camping months in the wood when his bones had been hollow with hunger and his mind had been full of Locket. Not the giddy half-sleep he had found after returning from the forest with the stone clenched in his fingers. This was something deeper, something that had set up shop in the marrow of him and shown no inclination to leave. He had walked into a forest expecting to die. He had not entirely come back out. A hand slipped into his. "You haven't moved," Hermione said quietly. "Not in nearly an hour." He had not noticed the hour. He turned his head and looked at her. There was a long gash drying along one cheekbone that someone, probably her, had refused to let anyone close yet. Her hair was full of grit. She looked at him steadily, and that was the thing about Hermione Granger. She had always been the kind of friend who would not flinch from what she found in your face. He said. It was the only sound he had made for some time. "Ron's with his mum," she said. "Yes." "George, they don't think, they don't know, he hasn't." She stopped. She did not, after all, want to lay that one down in front of him just yet. She squeezed his hand. "Come on," she said. "Come outside, the air is cleaner." He let her draw him out through the broken doors and onto the lawn. The sky over the lake was the absurd, ridiculous blue of a Scottish summer morning, blue all the way to the bone, scrubbed clean by the storm. Somewhere a bird was being a bird, oblivious, throwing its small voice at the world and not caring whether anyone deserved to hear it. The grass had gone to mud where the giants had stood. Beyond the gates, smoke was still rising out of one of the outbuildings, a thin gray thread feeding the flat blue. Hermione sat him down on a step and sat next to him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "I'm not staying," he said at last. She did not pretend to misunderstand. "Where then? Anywhere, not here, not Britain." "Harry, I can't do it, Hermione, I can't." He looked down at his own hands. They were cut in half a dozen places he had not noticed. There was someone else's blood on his sleeve. "If I stay, they'll want me at every funeral. They'll want me at the inquest. They'll want me to tell the story on the wireless. They'll want me to go to every memorial dinner and shake every hand and pretend I am all right with it. And I'm not all right with it. I'm not going to be all right with it for a long time, and I cannot do that with the country watching." She was quiet. Hermione's silences were never empty, she filled them with thinking. After a moment she said, "Kingsley will want to make you an Auror. Kingsley can want what he likes." "I am not joining the Aurors, did you tell him?" 20 minutes ago, he was very gracious. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He always is. He said the offer would stand. I didn't tell him not to bother. It seemed unkind." She looked at him sidelong. "And you're, what, going to vanish?" "For a year, maybe 2. I just want quiet, Hermione. Somewhere wet where the trees are thick, where nobody knows my face. I want to wake up in a place I'm not famous in." He breathed out. "I want a kettle to boil while I read a book and have nothing happen all day." "That sounds nice." She said softly, "You should try it." "I will eventually, after I've put a few things right." She touched his shoulder. Where Harry? He had not, until that moment, known. He stared down at the gravel between his feet and thought about Surrey and about Devon, and about the long, thin spit of the Welsh coast where he and Ron had flown a hippogriff once when nobody was looking, and none of it sat right. He thought of Diagon and the Burrow and Grimmauld with all its spite, and his stomach twisted. He thought, randomly, of a paperback novel Hermione had been reading in their tent in the wood, some American mystery, with a sodden gray town on the cover and tall pines bleeding into mist. She had turned the cover toward him and said, "It rains there more than anywhere in the country, did you know that? 200 days a year." He had said something like, "Well, that's lovely, isn't it?" And they had kept walking. "Forks," he said. "Sorry, that book you had, in the tent. The one with the sheriff was it. The one you said rains all the time." Her face changed. "Forks, Washington?" "Yeah, Harry," she blinked at him. "That was a novel. It's a real place though, isn't it?" Yes, it's a real place. It's in the Olympic Peninsula. It's tiny. 3,000 people, maybe. Is it on a map?" "Yes, of course it's on a." "Harry, you are not seriously going to pick a place to live based on the fact that I once read a paperback." "I'm picking a place to live," he said, "based on the fact that nobody will ever look for me there." She opened her mouth, closed it again, and very slowly let out a long breath. "All right," she said. All right, if that is where you have to go." She looked away over the lake, and for a moment her chin trembled, and then it stopped, because she was Hermione and she could decide that her chin would stop trembling, and it would. "But there are conditions. There are always conditions with you, mirror," she said. "You take a two-way mirror. The good kind. You speak to me once a week, every week, and if you skip a week I will come and find you, and I will be very cross. All right. You leave a forwarding address with the goblins, only the goblins, not the ministry, not the prophet, not Skeeter. All right. You take Creature's freedom papers with you and lodge them with Andromeda before you go, because that house elf will martyr himself the moment you are out of sight, and someone has to make sure he doesn't iron his own ears. All right. And you write to Teddy. Properly. Letters with stamps on, like a muggle. He will not know you if you leave him too long. That one cost him more than the others." He looked down at the gravel. "All right," he said. She studied him another moment, then leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, the way she had done in the wood when neither of them had anything left. He did not flinch from her this time. He had stopped flinching somewhere in the last 2 days. He had not yet noticed. "Forks, Washington." She said into his shoulder, "Merlin, help us all." The goblins were rude. They were always rude. But the rudeness today had a clipped, businesslike quality that suggested he was being taken seriously. He sat across the long mahogany desk from Bogrod's elderly cousin, a creature with a face like tooled leather and 3 grandsons in the next room counting galleons. and he laid the matter out in plain terms. "I want my finances put in a state where I can live on the proceeds without touching the principal," he said, "anywhere on Earth. I want a Muggle proxy in the United States who can buy me a house in cash in an unobtrusive name. I want the black properties which still belong to me locked, warded, and left alone until I write to you again. I want a stipend going to Andromeda Tonks for the Lupin boy until he comes of age. And I want the door of this office closed to anyone who comes in here asking after me." Including the ministry, the goblin's eyes glittered. "Including," he repeated, "the minister himself, especially the minister himself." A long, thin smile spread along the leather face. "Mr. Potter," said the goblin, "we had thought after the matter of the dragon that we and you were perhaps not on terms. I returned the sword. You did. And the dragon was not, as it turned out, harmed. The dragon," said the goblin, "was extremely cross, so were we. I expect so. However," the goblin folded his fingers, "we are aware that without your particular efforts the 7th of this past month the war would not, as you say, be over. That has weight. It has costing weight. We are prepared to consider you a client of the bank in good standing on terms." "On what terms?" "That you do not, henceforth, ride any of our dragons, fine, or borrow our swords, fine, or, indeed, set foot in our vaults again until invited, done." The goblin looked for a goblin satisfied. He produced a sheaf of parchment, dipped a quill, and got to work. And within an hour and a half Harry had a Muggle proxy, an American attorney with goblin connections and the discretion of a confessor, a steady monthly stipend in dollars going into an account in Olympia, Washington, and a very firm, very legal silence cast over every public record connected to his name. He left Gringotts feeling, for the first time in 3 days, that something had gone the way he meant it to. Ron and Hermione walked him to the apparition point. Ron had not slept. Ron had not slept properly in more than a week, in fact, and the bones of his face stood out under the skin in a way that made him look 10 years older than he was. And he had a way, now, of rubbing his thumb over his forefinger, as if he were searching for a wedding ring he did not yet wear. He had not cried at the hall. He had cried very quietly in the kitchen at the Burrow after the door was shut with Hermione's hand in his. Harry had pretended not to hear. "You're really going? I'm really going. Bloody forks, Harry, it's not even a real word." "It's a real word, Ron, you put your beans on it." Bloody beans, Washington, I tell you. They were standing on the gravel outside the 3 broomsticks. There was a bag at Harry's feet, one bag, undetectable extension, light as a coat, and a portkey clutched in his palm with the timing on it set for noon Pacific, and a sky over Hogsmeade that had the clean, astonished blue of a country that had not had a war until very recently. Ron put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed and let go and rubbed at his own eyes briskly with the back of his hand. "Right," he said. "Right," Harry said. "Don't get eaten." "I won't. American bears, mate, big buggers. I'll be fine." Ron looked at him a moment with all the love and exhaustion in him sitting plainly on his face, and then he nodded once and stepped back, and let his fiancée take Harry's other hand briefly and lean up to kiss his cheek, and that was that. The portkey gave a tug behind his navel, and Hogsmeade and Britain and the long blue sky over the dead were gone. He came down on a hillside in the rain. The hillside had been described to him in writing by a man called Mr. Olson, a Muggle property attorney out of Olympia, and he recognized it in the way one recognizes a face from a photograph. There was the leaning, split-rail fence the photograph had shown. There were the cedars the photograph had shown, only taller and wetter and far more numerous than any photograph could convey. There was the gravel turnoff and the long, thin track winding up between trunks, and at the top of the track there was the small square house with the red metal roof and the chimney and the porch with the screen door hanging slightly off. True, it was raining. Of course it was raining. The rain was steady and gray and not unfriendly. It put itself on his hair and on his shoulders and in the corners of his eyes, and after about a minute of standing there in it, he found that he was, very gently, smiling. He picked up his bag. He walked up the track in the rain. The key was where the attorney had said it would be, under a flower pot with no flower in it on the porch, and the door opened on a small, dim, clean front room with a stone hearth and a kettle on the hob and a window that looked out over the trees. There was nothing in the room that was Harry's, and that, in itself, felt like a deliberate kindness. He stood in the doorway with his bag in his hand and listened. He listened for the long breath of a castle settling. He listened for the creak of the stair on the upstairs landing. He listened for Creature's grumble or Hermione's quill or Mrs. Weasley calling somebody to dinner, and he did not hear any of those things. He heard the rain on the metal roof, which was a sound like nothing else in the world, a high, sweet tin sound, half music, and he heard, far off, the long groan of a pine giving in the wind, and he heard, very faintly, the slow, low pulse of his own blood in his ears. It was the first quiet he had had in 7 years. He set the bag down. He closed the door behind him. He walked into the small kitchen and lit the burner under the kettle with a thought, because old habits, and stood with his hands on the counter while the water went from cold to roaring. When the kettle whistled, he made tea. He had brought his own tin, and he carried the cup back through to the front room and sat down on a chair he had not chosen and would in time make his own. He held the cup in both hands and felt the heat of it move through his palms into the bones of his wrists, and he watched the rain on the window. After a while it occurred to him, the way an old splinter sometimes works its way up out of a finger after months of being forgotten, that he was, perhaps, all right, not whole. Not yet, but all right. He did not know that night, sitting in a stranger's chair in a stranger's house in a stranger's country, that he was already being noticed. 6,000 miles away, in a city that had looked the same for 1,000 years, a man with hair the color of milk and the eyes of a long-dead saint paused in the act of laying a hand upon a tracker's wrist. The tracker had been speaking quietly. The tracker had been describing, in the way that Demetri had ever described, the shape of the world, the network of small bright presences, the millions of moving lights that were minds and were therefore findable. He had been saying with a small frown that there had appeared that very week a kind of whole, not a thing absent, not a death. A presence strong, very strong, perhaps the strongest he had ever felt, except that the moment he tried to take its measure his sense of it slid off, the way a finger slid off oiled glass. It was, the tracker said, in a wet, dark country he had never paid much mind to. The northwest of America. A small, polite, curious smile had moved across the milk-white face. "How interesting," said Arrow, very softly, and he removed his hand. In the same hour, in the small house on the hill, Harry Potter set his empty cup on the windowsill, leaned his head against the cold glass, and slept for the first time in a week without dreaming. The rain came down all night. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Rain and Strangers. The truck the attorney had left for him was older than he was. It was a Ford, of a green that suggested somebody had once tried to repaint it with house paint, and the door on the driver's side had a way of falling open at the wrong moments, and the radio worked only on AM. And only on the one channel out of Aberdeen that played country songs about people whose dogs had gone away. Harry liked it intensely. He had never owned a car. Cars in Britain were Mr. Weasley's hobby, and Mr. Weasley's hobby was a thing for Mr. Weasley, and Harry had grown up assuming in the back of his mind that a car was something you got into rather than something you piloted. The truck taught him otherwise. He got the hang of the clutch on the second day and stalled it only twice on the third, and by the end of the first week he could rattle into Forks at 5 in the morning and back at 8:30 with 3 bags of groceries in the bed and a feeling, however faint, that he had done something with his day. Forks was small the way a stone in a stream is small. It had the kind of smallness that hides whole worlds under it if you looked. Main Street was a narrow ribbon between low buildings, the diner and the pharmacy and the hardware store and the police station with its dented sign. Beyond Main, in any direction, the trees took over within a quarter mile. The trees in the Olympic Peninsula were unlike any tree he had grown up around. They were fast and tall and absolutely uninterested in him. They went up into mist that did not lift before noon and sometimes did not lift at all, and they made a kind of sighing sound when the wind moved through them that was the closest thing he had heard in his life to silence. he liked the silence. He found, in his first 10 days, that nobody much looked at him. He had grown up a famous boy in a country where his face had been on a poster in every shop window from Lowestoft to Lerwick, and he had spent the last decade learning all the small social tricks of being looked at. How to walk with his head down. How to time a glance away from a stranger so that they would not approach. Those tricks were no longer needed. The people of Forks had their own troubles. They glanced up when he came in for a coffee, and they nodded the way you nod at any face you do not yet know, and then they went back to their pancakes. It was, perhaps, the most extraordinary gift he had ever received. He met Charlie Swan on the second Wednesday. It was at the diner, which was called the Lodge in big chipped letters on the front, and called the diner by everyone in town. Harry had made a habit of stopping there for coffee on the way home from his Tuesday run to the hardware store, and he liked the booths along the window, and the waitress, a woman named Cora, who had taken a liking to him after he had complimented her pie without flinching at the size of the slice. Cora was the only person in town that first month who voluntarily said anything to him. She called him Han, which had a way of putting him at ease he could not quite explain. The chief came in just after 8 in his uniform with the radio on his shoulder and the badge dimming in the rain, and he sat himself down in the booth opposite Harry without preamble, because the diner was full and the booth was the only one with a free seat. And he set his hat down between them and said, in the voice of a man who had been awake too long, "Black coffee, Cora, and one of those things you call hash browns and the world calls a felony." "Mornin', Chief." "Cora." She set down a mug at his elbow without asking and disappeared again. The chief blew on his coffee, took a swallow, made a face, took another, made a less aggrieved face, and then looked over the rim at Harry in the way a man with a badge will look at a stranger in his town, friendly enough but with a notebook in his eyes. "I'm Charlie Swan," he said. "Harry." "Harry, just Harry," said Harry, and then, because the chief's eyebrows had risen by a 1/4 inch, Harry Black. "Black, my godfather's name? Ah," the chief's eyebrows came back down. "English?" "Yes, sir, you bought the Olsen place out by the ridge. That was quick. Small town." "Olsen's been gone 2 years and the place has been empty. Word travels." The chief swirled his cup. "What brought you to Forks?" "The rain," said Harry, and that, evidently, was the right answer. The corner of Charlie Swan's mouth twitched into a very faint line that did duty in his face for a smile. "Most people leave on account of the rain, son. I read a book. It made the place sound peaceful. You read the wrong book if it was the one I'm thinking of. I dare say I did." "But I'm here now." The chief considered him a moment longer and then nodded once and took another swallow of his coffee, and that was the moment Harry passed inspection. He could feel it the way you felt the click of a lock falling open. The chief, satisfied that the new English boy on the ridge was no kind of trouble, set the question down. "You hunting?" said the chief. "I'm sorry. Up at the ridge. Lot of deer up there. Coyotes in spring. Black bears come down for the trash if you don't keep it under a lid." "I'd offer to lend you a rifle, but I don't know you." "I don't shoot, I keep the trash under the lid." "Good." The chief folded his hands on the table. "Stick to the gravel road on your way down. Logging trucks come through there at 5 and they don't slow for anybody." "I will, chief, thank you, and steer clear of La Push at night." "Sir, the reservation, La Push, long story, just stay on the highway after dark." "Yes, sir." The chief drank his coffee. Cora set down a plate that did, in fact, look slightly criminal, and the chief addressed himself to it. The bell over the diner door chimed. A girl came in with a wet jacket pulled up over her head, shaking water off her sleeves, and the chief lifted a hand without looking up. "Bells, Dad, they didn't have the Honda part. Ordered. 2 weeks. Good." The girl came over to the booth with the slow self-consciousness of someone who has noticed there is a stranger in it. She had a clever, narrow face and the kind of close-set, watchful eyes that took in a room before they settled on a person. Her hair was longer than Hermione's and had the same way of sticking to the side of her face when it was wet. "Hi," she said politely, and to her father, "I'll just sit down. You haven't eaten, Dad. Sit down, kid." She sat, with a small embarrassed shrug at Harry, who shifted his elbows to give her room, and she set a paperback face down beside her plate with such automatic care that he could see, even upside down, that the spine had been reglued more than once. Wuthering Heights. He felt briefly a small absurd pang of homesickness. "Bella," said the chief, "this is Harry Black. He's bought the Olsen place." "Hi," said Bella. "Hi, you're English. Last time I checked." She gave him a small, dry look that he had not expected, a flicker of humor that her face had not advertised, and then she said, "You don't sound like the movies." "Different part of the country," said Harry. "I'm from London. The movies are usually doing Yorkshire." "Oh, you can hate me anyway." She smiled, very small, and looked down at her plate. The chief snorted into his coffee. He was leaving the diner an hour later when he felt it for the first time. It was a small thing. He had been walking along the front of the diner toward the truck with his hands in his coat pockets, and the rain was coming down in that particular fine way that put itself on every surface at once, and he was thinking, vaguely, about what he was going to make himself for dinner and whether he had remembered to buy onions, and the rain, all at once, went thinner. That was how it felt. As though the air against his face had grown suddenly less alive, he stopped walking. He had spent enough time in his years around things that were not human to recognize the feeling. He had felt it the first time he had stood in the same room as a Dementor. He had felt it the first time his hand had closed on the locket. He had felt it once, very briefly, in a corridor in Hogwarts when the bloody Baron had passed through the wall behind him. It was the feeling of a thing that had no warmth in it being in his vicinity. It was the feeling of a hole standing where a person ought to be, across the parking lot, in the corner where the rain ran off the roof of the pharmacy. A man was standing very still beside a silver car. He was tall. He had hair like nothing Harry had ever seen, not blonde, not brown, a kind of dim copper that the wet light loved, and his skin was the color of paper that had been kept out of the sun for 100 years. He wore a long gray coat. He was watching Harry across the parking lot, very carefully and not pretending he was not. For a long moment they looked at each other. The man's expression did not change. His face had the still, intent quality of a museum face, of marble lit from above. There was no kindness in it and no cruelty either. There was only attention. Harry held the look. He did not, on any level he could put a name to, feel afraid. He had stood at the end of the wand of Voldemort, and that had not afforded him the courtesy of a long, polite stare in a parking lot. He felt instead a small, careful interest. He thought, he thought, so that's what one of those looks like. The thing across the parking lot, for he was not going to call it a man yet, not on the basis of what he could feel, gave a small, almost imperceptible inclination of the head. The kind of bow a stranger gives to another stranger when both have noticed each other in a way that requires acknowledgement, and then turned its face away and did not look at Harry again. A second figure came out of the pharmacy with a paper bag, a small dark girl with hair like a black cap, who stopped on the threshold and stood very still for several seconds, looking at nothing in particular and seeing, Harry was abruptly sure, something very particular. She turned her head slowly in his direction, and her eyes, when they landed on him, were not the eyes of a girl in a town. He could feel, distantly, the way something was sliding off him as it tried to settle, like a finger sliding off oiled glass. He gave her, deliberately, the smallest of nods. He was raised, polite. The girl's lips parted just slightly in something that might in another face have been the start of a laugh, and then she was at the silver car, and the silver car was pulling out of the lot, and they were gone. Harry stood with his hands in his coat pockets and the rain on his hair and waited for his pulse to settle, which it was good enough to do almost at once. He had gone past the age of being startled by things he could not immediately classify. He turned after a moment and got into the truck and started the engine. He drove the long road home thinking about the feeling of nothing standing where a person ought to be. He had been right, he had not been afraid, but he had been awake. That afternoon he opened the trunk at the foot of the bed in the smaller of the upstairs rooms, took out the long, thin parcel he had brought wrapped in a flannel shirt, unwrapped the shirt, and laid the wand on the coverlet. It was the same wand he had carried out of the forest. It was 11.5 inches of holly, and on the desk beside it he set, after a moment's thought, a second wand, pale, knobbed at one end, longer than the first, which he had not advertised to anyone except to Hermione once in a low voice. Since he had snapped its predecessor and given the unsplinted half a polite ceremonial burial. He looked at the second wand for a while. The elder wand was supposed to be in a tomb. He had laid it there after the battle with all the proper ceremony in the marble of Dumbledore's grave, while Hermione watched and Ron stood guard at the lake's edge. He had walked away from it. He had come home and slept the sleep of a man who had put a thing down at last. He had then woken the next morning with the wand on the bedside table beside him. He had gone and put it back. Twice. By the third morning he had stopped trying. The wand, it appeared, had its own opinions on whose owner it was and was inclined to lobby. He had wrapped it in a flannel shirt at the bottom of his trunk and told no one, because he was very tired and because he suspected Hermione would have called him an idiot for noticing this, and then going to America anyway, and he had not, that week, been ready to be called an idiot. He looked at it now in the gray pewter light of his Forks bedroom, and he said aloud, mildly, "Right." The second wand did not answer. It was a piece of wood. It had only ever on its very best days been a piece of wood. He picked it up. The handle warmed under his fingers in the way that a long-known thing warms. He did not, in this house, have to lock it in a trunk. He opened the closet, and behind a stack of folded sheets with a thought, he set in place a small, careful set of wards, 3 layers, light, the third invisible to anything that was not actively looking. It took him perhaps 90 seconds. When he was done, the air in the closet had a small humming weight to it, like a pressed thumb. He laid the elder wand inside on the sheets and closed the door. He stood for a moment with his palm flat on the wood. He thought of the man in the long gray coat. He thought of the dark girl with the eyes that had not been girl's eyes. He thought mildly, "I've come a long way to be left alone, and it appears I am not, after all, going to be left alone, and that is fine, actually. I am not, in fact, surprised." He picked up the holly wand from the bed, slipped it up his sleeve in the old practiced way, and went downstairs to make dinner. In a tower in a city that had looked the same for 1,000 years, the milk-white man rose from a long, thin stone seat and walked the length of his audience chamber, and his footsteps made no sound at all on the marble. "He has been seen," said Demetri quietly from the door. "Forks in the state of Washington. Carlyle's clan are there. Arrow touched his lips with a long, pale finger. "And our friend the tracker, our gift from old quarters, he is willing? He is. He hunts a girl in that town already. He says he can be sent without anyone asking why. Send him. Quietly, he is to look, not touch." A small, gentle smile moved across Arrow's face. "Anyone who breaks the latter rule will displease me." "Yes, master." Arrow turned back to the long stone window where the lights of Volterra lay below in their ancient pattern. He folded his hands. How interesting. He murmured to no one, to himself, to the night, that the world should turn up something new. In Forks, in a small house on a hillside, Harry put a plate on the table and sat down to eat with the rain on the roof and the wind in the cedars and his back to the warm side of the stove. And he was, for one whole long quiet hour, no one's enemy and no one's prophecy and no one's saint. He thought, just before he went up to bed, "I will not pretend I did not see them. They are here. I am here. Sooner or later we will meet on purpose." He turned out the light. The rain came down all night. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The scent of magic Edward Cullen had not been wrong about a person's mind in nearly a century. He had occasionally been wrong about the meaning of what he heard there. Minds were noisy and often badly organized, and he had learned to give weight to recurrence rather than to the loud one-off thoughts a person was likeliest to be performing for an internal audience. But he had not. Since the day he had risen from the influenza ward with Carlyle's golden eyes hovering over him, been unable to find a mind. The minds of cattle came to him as low, rolling textures of hunger and cud. The minds of dogs came to him as bright, sharp points of love and idiocy. The minds of human beings came to him as full novels, as orchestras, as the long, tangled monologues of creatures who had never been given the inner privacy they thought they had. The Englishman in the parking lot had come to him as silence, not a closed mind. He had felt closed minds before. Bella Swan was one, and there was the texture of velvet across a window in those, the sense that a mind was pressing back gently against him from the other side of something soft and intentional. This had not been velvet. This had been air. This had been the absence of any signal at all, as though the place where the boy stood had not been occupied by a person, but by a whole. Edward had not been afraid. Edward did not, by temperament, do afraid. He did rage, he did contempt, he did a kind of restrained and brittle love. But he had been, for the first time in many decades, alert in the way an animal is alert, and that had been a feeling he did not know how to file. He had walked past Alice in the parking lot without speaking to her. They had both of them got into the car without speaking. They had driven the long, winding road back to the house above the river, and at the head of the drive Alice had said very softly, "I cannot see him. At all. Not a flicker. He's a fog. I look for him and the future goes gray." "He looked at me," Edward said. Like he was deciding whether to be polite. "I noticed." They had told Carlyle that evening over the long table in the dining room they did not, themselves, eat at. And Carlyle had set down the journal he was reading and folded his fine, pale hands on the table and looked at them both with the particular thoughtful quiet that was his inheritance from a father 2.5 centuries dead. "Tell me everything you saw," he had said. They had told him. Carlyle had been silent for a long time. Esme had set down a cup of coffee that was, of course, not for her. They were practicing in those years a small companionable theater for Bella, who had been over for dinner more nights than not, and had laid her hand on his wrist, and Carlyle had patted it absently. The way a man pats a hand he has held for 100 years. "You did right not to approach," he said at last. "Both of you?" "What is he?" Alice had said. Carlyle had looked for a long moment into the dim wood grain of the table. "I don't know," he had said. "But I have seen a thing once before that I could not see, and that thing was not, in the end, a thing to be afraid of unless you had given it cause. I would like to talk to him, quietly, before any of the others do." "Carlyle, quietly, Edward. He frightens me, and I am not afraid of anything." "Yes," Carlyle had said gently, "and that is precisely why he interests me." 3 days later it was Bella, and not any of the Cullens, who saw Harry first. It was at the grocery store on Callowa, on a Saturday afternoon when Forks did its weekly small, purposeful migration toward bread and milk and frozen things in cellophane. Bella had been left in charge of a list with her father's handwriting on it, and she had been picking through tomatoes when she had felt a presence beside her at the next bin and looked up to find the Englishman from the diner squinting suspiciously at a cantaloupe. "Bad melon." She had said before she could think better of it. He looked over. His face flickered into a small surprised pleasure at seeing her, the kind that was, she noticed even then, a little careful, as though he was a man who had taught himself not to show too much pleasure too easily. "I have no idea," he said and held it up to her. "Is this what one wants from a melon? You knock it, knock it with your knuckles." She demonstrated on her own an unrelated melon, and a small dull thwack came out of it. "If it sounds hollow it's good, if it sounds like nothing it's not." He turned the cantaloupe gravely in his hand and rapped it. The cantaloupe made a sound that suggested it had been recently filled with wet sand. "That'll be a no, then," said Harry. "That'll be a no." He set the melon back. He smiled, very small. He had, she realized, the kind of green eyes that were not as remarkable on first look as they were on second. His eyes were, she did not, at the time, have words for this, busy. His eyes had things to do. He was using them. They stood for a moment, awkwardly, beside the melons. "How's your father?" he said, because he was, she noticed, the kind of person who had been raised by somebody on what to say and what not to. "Tired. That's a hard job. It is. He was kind to me. He's like that with people he doesn't immediately want to arrest. That is a relief." She laughed unexpectedly. She had not planned to laugh. She did not, generally, laugh in supermarkets. But there was something about him, about the studied small dryness of him, about the way his shoulders sat carefully at home in their coat, that loosened something in her she had not known she was carrying. She was about to say something else, something about her own list, when her phone buzzed in her back pocket. and she did the small absent half-pat that one did, and saw, in the corner of her eye, the air at the end of the aisle do a kind of polite, respectful shift. The Cullens were in the store. It was Edward and Alice. Esme would not have come on a Saturday, and Carlyle was at the hospital. And Jasper avoided the trip generally because the smell of the meat counter was a thing he was working on, and would prefer not to test under fluorescent lights in front of the human public. They had come up from the back of the store. They could walk through stores so silently that even the camera on its little pivot did not register them as a thing it should track. And they had stopped, dead, in the middle of the floor. Bella had felt rather than seen the change in Harry. He did not turn, he did not stiffen. He had set one hand very lightly on the metal lip of the produce display, and his weight, by some small, unobtrusive shift, had moved into his back foot. He had become, she realized some time later when she was lying in bed and turning the moment over in the dark, perfectly still in the way a wild thing is still when it has noticed a wolf and has not yet decided what kind of stillness will keep it alive. Harry. Bella said, aware of the thinness of her own voice, "Those are friends of mine. The Cullens? All right. Edward, Alice, this is Harry Black. He's new." Edward had a way of making his face a still thing on purpose. He used it now. He inclined his head fractionally the way he had inclined it across the parking lot, and he said, in a voice with the careful courtliness of a man 80 years older than he looked, "Mr. Black. Mr. Cullen. My sister Alice. Pleasure." Alice was looking at him with the kind of unblinking smile that on her was not eerie until you noticed it had been going for 40 seconds without modulation. "Hi," she said brightly, and then, because she had, with effort, made herself sound like a small person, "Hi." There was a small beat. "You're staying near the ridge," Edward said. "I am. It's quiet up there. That is the idea. You'll find it changes in winter. I've lived in Scotland." A small thing happened in Edward's eyes. Bella did not see it. Alice did. The thing in his eyes was the very quiet blink of a man who had been told, very politely, not to underestimate the person in front of him. "Yes," Edward said with care. "I imagine that is bracing. It's an education." There was another beat. "Well," Bella said, because the silence had begun to feel like a third person standing between them, I should my list. Of course. Lovely to meet you," said Alice brightly, as though she were 19 and bright and did not know anything about anything, which was the surest sign that she did. "We'll see you around." "I expect so," said Harry. The Cullens drifted away down the aisle. The air pressure in the supermarket went, by some unmeasurable degree, back up. Bella looked at him. Harry was watching the bin of melons. "You know them," she said, sort of. "You looked at them the way Charlie looks at out-of-towners. That's a comparison I'll be flattered by later. Harry." He glanced at her, a small, candid, sidelong look. There was a kind of measure in it she had not seen in any face her age. "I noticed them in town the other day," he said. "We didn't speak. They interested me. I think we may have interested each other. That happens sometimes between people." "It usually doesn't happen with the Cullens." "No," he said. "I imagine it doesn't." He picked up another melon, knocked it, found it sound, and put it in his basket. "Tell your father," he said, as if changing the subject, "that I'm coming round on Saturday with a fence post and a hammer to fix the bit of his porch railing he was complaining about. He muttered it at me at the diner, and I do not think he expected me to remember, but I write things down." "You write things down?" "I write things down," she blinked. "I'll tell him. Thank you." He gave her a very small wave with one hand and pushed his trolley off down the aisle, and Bella stood with her hand on a tomato she had not meant to pick up and watched him go. She felt, distantly in the back of her ribs, the kind of quickening she did not feel often around people. He was, she thought, not what she had assumed in the diner. There was a shape under his skin that she did not yet have a name for. Up by the cereal, Alice and Edward had stopped at the end of the row. They were not, particularly, looking at the cereal. "He is not afraid of us," Edward said quietly. "No," Alice said. "He's not. You still can't see him." "I cannot, and it's worse now. Around him my visions have a haze. As though he is eating the future." "That is a phrase," said Edward, "that I am going to ask you not to say to Carlyle in those exact words." "All right, Alice." "Yes. Did you see when we walked in, did you notice his hand on the bin?" I noticed. He was getting ready to throw it through us. Alice considered the cereal a moment. That was my read, yes. Edward did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said very softly, I think Carlyle will want him for dinner. I think Carlyle will get him for dinner. That night, the wolves of La Push smelled the wrong thing in the air for the first time. Sam Uli came up from the beach where he had been showing his 3-year-old cousin how to throw small flat stones and not skip them, and he stopped on the path with the back of his neck prickling, and he looked east into the thick dark country between the reservation and Forks, and he said, Jake. Yeah, you smell that. Jacob Black was 1.5 years too young in those days to have phased. The wolf was in him. The long, slow heat of it was already tightening his joints in his sleep at night. But he had not yet broken into the run, and his nose, in human form, was sharp the way a clever dog's nose was sharp. And not the way a wolf's was. He lifted his head. What, like Leech? No, Sam was still. Older. There's something in the woods, Jake. It's not them. Is it bad? I don't know yet. Sam looked at him sidelong. The boy was 13 and had the broad, warm face of his father and the long, dark, considering eyes of his grandmother. And Sam had lately begun to think of him in the way the alpha in his head had begun to think of all of them, as inheritance, as a thing he was responsible for. Stay on this side of the river tonight, he said. Tell Embry, tell Quill I'm going to walk it. Sam, I'll be back before dawn. He had not been afraid as he set off into the trees. Sam Uli had not, since the day he had first found himself a wolf, been afraid of much, but he had been, by the time he came home, more thoughtful than usual, and he had stood for a long time on the porch of the house he shared with Emily, looking out into the rain, and said to her eventually, There's a thing in that house up on the ridge. What kind of thing, Sam? A man, but not entirely. There's a hum on him. The forest goes quiet about 10 yards off his porch and it doesn't come back. It isn't Leech. It isn't anything it's old, Em. It feels old. She had taken his hand. Will it hurt us? I don't know. Will it hurt the boys? I don't know. She had drawn him inside. Hermione's letter came 2 mornings later. It came in the Muggle post, in a long white envelope with American stamps that Mr. Olson had bought for her at her exact instruction. And inside it, in her small, neat, unmistakable hand, were 3 pages and a clipping from the Prophet. The clipping was a small one. It was about a body in a Birmingham alley. The body had been a low-level Death Eater nobody had especially missed. The body had been left, however, with a small black mark burned into the inside of its left forearm that was not the mark proper but a parody of it. Above the mark, in dripping letters someone had cut, we remember, Hermione's note said, New cell. Yaxley people working on it, don't come home. Behind that, on a second sheet, Macusa know you're there. I'm sorry, Harry, I don't know how. There will be an order, be polite to her. He read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea cooling at his elbow, he thought mildly. Well, of course, he had not after all expected the world to end its business with him merely because he had moved across an ocean. The world was not, in his experience, that sort of obliging. He folded the letter in half, then in quarters, then in eighths. He set it down on the table, set his palm over it, and let it become a small, neat curl of ash. He brushed the ash into his cup, drank his tea, rinsed the cup, and went out to the woodshed to split kindling. He was, by that evening, when the light went purple and then gray through the cedars, halfway through the cord. The axe came up, the axe came down. The wood opened. The wood opened again. The rain began. He had a great deal to do. He had a country to be honest with. He had 2 old families, neither of them his, who had begun in their own ways to walk toward him through the trees. He had a tracker out of an old continent who, although he did not yet know it, had crossed a border. He had, very far off, a long, pale man with the eyes of a long-dead saint, who had begun to think of him in a way that was both polite and patient. The axe came down. Harry Potter, late of Britain, set himself another piece of cedar on the block, lifted the axe again, and split it cleanly in 2. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Cold Encounters. Carlyle came up the gravel track on foot. He did it on purpose. He had left the car at the bottom of the drive, in the muddy turnout by the leaning split-rail fence, and he had walked up between the cedars in the slow, careful, deliberate way of a doctor approaching a horse. he had no business being in a paddock with. He had even, in a small concession, made his footfalls audible. He could have moved up that track in absolute silence. He could have moved up that track in a line, in fact, that did not register on a single twig. He did neither. He came up the track at a normal man's pace with his polished black shoes crunching on the gravel, and he stopped at the foot of the steps and stood there with his hands open at his sides. He waited. He waited a full minute. The screen door opened. Harry Black was standing in the doorway with a tea towel over one shoulder, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a long, thin piece of pale wood held loose in his right hand against his thigh. The wood was, Carlyle was nearly sure, not actually a stick. He was nearly sure, and he was very pleased that the boy at the door was making it possible for him to be nearly sure rather than absolutely sure, because absolute sureness in such a matter between strangers was the sort of thing wars came of. "Dr. Cullen, Mr. Black, you walked up from the road." "I did. That was civil." "I was hoping you would think so." The boy considered him. His eyes were the green of moss in deep shade. They were tired in a way Carlyle had not seen on a face that young in 60 years. "Come in," said Harry. "I've put the kettle on." Carlyle Cullen had drunk a great many cups of tea in his time on earth, in the way that a man who had spent 2 centuries in the company of people might be said to have read a great many books he could not eat the pages of. The tea did not reach his stomach in any meaningful way. But the warmth of it in his palms was companionable, and the gesture of holding a cup was an old one. He sat in a small, dim sitting room with a cracked leather chair and a low table and a bookshelf that had, he marked, idly, 3 Muggle novels, 1 battered Latin grammar, a copy of a play Carlyle had himself been shown in the original folio in 1671, and, second from the left on the lower shelf, a small bound book in a language Carlyle had not seen since Rome. "That's a Plutarch," said Harry. "It is. It's my godfather's. It is a good copy. He stole it from a friend at school. He could not, when he died, remember which friend. Most of the men who stole their books at school cannot." Harry smiled, very small, and sat opposite him with his own cup. The wand was, Carlyle noticed with respect, no longer in his hand. The wand had not been put away. The wand was up his sleeve, the way a knife was up a man's sleeve, and that was a sensible arrangement, and Carlyle did not begrudge it. They sat with their tea between them. "I don't know how to begin this conversation," Carlyle said at last. "I find," said Harry, "that the trick with conversations like this is to pretend you are at a dinner party and to ask the polite first question." "All right," Carlyle considered. "Where are you from?" "London, Surrey originally, but London for school." "And what brought you to Forks?" "The rain." "The privacy." "The lack of national newspapers. Are you being looked for?" "I was. Less now, My turn," said Harry, "please. How long have you been a doctor?" "In its present form since 1911. Harry's face did not change. "How old are you, Dr. Cullen?" "I was born in 1640. "That is a useful number to have." "It is a useful number. Esme?" 1895. "The young man with the copper hair." 1901. "The girl from the parking lot." "That is more complicated. Alice does not remember being born in any meaningful sense. She has been with us about 60 years. "I see." There was a small, uneasy silence. The rain on the metal roof did its high, sweet work. "Mr. Black," Carlyle said very gently, "may I ask what you are?" "You may." "Are you human?" Harry considered. He did, Carlyle saw, not have the usual instinct of a young man to resent that question. He was, instead, turning it over to see how to answer it. The fact that he was turning it over was in its own way an answer. "I am a wizard," he said at last. "I was born one. I was born to a witch and a wizard, in fact, who were murdered when I was 15 months old by a wizard with very strong opinions, on whom, eventually, I returned the favor. I was educated between the ages of 11 and 17 at a school on a Scottish loch in the discipline of the manipulation of the natural world by intent. I have spent the greater part of the last 2 years at war." He said it in a voice with no theater in it. Carlyle, who had listened in his time to the confessions of dying men of every condition, recognized the quality of voice. "There are more of you," he said, "in Britain alone, perhaps 30,000, Worldwide, perhaps 1 million. We have, I think, been here since people have. And the Muggles. The non-magical, yes, they've never known. Why, it saves a great deal of bother. Oh, said Carlyle, who knew about bother. Yes, he set down his cup. You have made a tea, he said with magic. You noticed? The water came to the boil too quickly. That was the kettle. Harry tilted his head. A demonstration would be politer. It would. Harry held out his open palm. The cup on the small table between them rose, very gently, 6 inches into the air, unscrewed itself in a polite small twist, became a single small bird in white china, a wren, Carlyle thought. A wren with a folded wing, and stood briefly on Harry's palm. It tilted its small beak head. It flew in 3 precise wing beats the length of the room. It landed on the bookshelf beside the Plutarch. It was then a teacup again. Carlyle did not breathe for a long moment in the fond habit of long disuse. Then he drew in air. Oh, he said, it's a small thing. Yes, said Carlyle with an odd small laugh. I imagine it is. Harry looked at him with something nearly amused. He had clearly expected to have to explain more. He had not expected, Carlyle saw, to be believed in the second sentence. I have lived a long time, Carlyle said. I have seen a great many things. I have, as it happens, twice in my life suspected something like the existence of what you are, and I have been told both times by people I respected that I was being childish, and I have, both times, decided to be quietly childish in private. Mr. Black. Harry. Harry, I do not in any way represent a threat to you. I know, you do, you walked up the drive on foot. Ah, also your eyes are gold. Ah, I have read about your kind, Dr. Cullen, not much. We do not write much down on the subject. We tend to leave one another alone where we can. But I have read enough to know that your kind do not, in the usual run of things, have gold eyes. The gold means something? I think it means a man and his family have decided not to drink humans. I think that is rare. I think it is the right answer. I think it is, in fact, an answer I should be very glad to know you have made. Carlyle bowed his head briefly, in the small old courtly gesture of a man much older than he looked. Thank you, he said. Thank you for coming up the drive on foot. They talked after that for nearly 2 hours. Harry asked careful questions and Carlyle answered them. Carlyle asked careful questions and Harry answered them. They drank a kettleful of tea between them, although in Carlyle's case, the cup was lifted as a courtesy more than as an action. Carlyle described Volterra in Italy, and Arrow, and the kings of Carlyle's kind, with their long pale hands and their thrones of stone and their guard. Harry listened with a quiet attention that did not flinch when the story darkened. Harry described the ministry of magic and Voldemort and a war in which he had been the center and the end. Carlyle listened with a long, deep, interested silence, and when Harry had finished he said gently, How old are you, Harry? 18 in July. Yes. You have done a great deal in 18 years. It was 18 years too quickly. It was. The silence sat between them companionably. It was at exactly that moment that Edward came up the drive. Edward did not walk. Edward came up the drive at speed, between 2 and 3 breaths, and stopped on the porch with his hand on the screen door and his face set, and he opened the screen door without knocking and stepped through. Harry, in his chair by the window, did not look up. Edward. Carlyle said warningly. He has a wand at his thigh, Edward said. Harry looked up at last, with mild interest. The wand at his thigh was, in fact, holly. He had never put it back up his sleeve from the moment of the teacup. He had, Carlyle noticed for the first time, also not, at any point in the last 2 hours, set it down on the table. Yes, Harry said, I do. Carlyle, Edward, sit. I am not going to sit. Carlyle's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Edward, who had defied him on small matters and large for 100 years, sat down on the small spare wooden chair near the door. Harry watched him. I'm sorry, he said eventually, that I make you uneasy. Edward did not answer. I do not mean to. I have, in fact, made no plans on you whatever. I came to this town to be left alone. My sister can't see you. That's interesting. My sister can see anything? That, too, is interesting. You aren't human. I am, in fact. I'm a wizard. Carlyle and I have just spent 2 hours establishing it. Have a cup of tea. I don't drink tea. No, you don't drink tea. There was a pause. Edward looked at Harry. Edward looked at Carlyle. Edward looked at Harry again. He was, Carlyle noticed with affection, very young in that moment. He had been forever 23 for over 100 years, and there were days when he had earned every minute of those years with grace, and there were days when he was a boy whose mother had not been able to rest him because he had a temper. This was the second sort of day. "You looked at me in the parking lot," Edward said, "as though you had decided whether I was a threat." "I had." "What did you decide?" "I decided that if you came at me without warning, I would put you across the parking lot. I also decided that you would not come at me without warning." The second decision was the operative one. The first decision was a habit. There was another small pause. "Why does my mind not work on you?" Edward said. "Your mind." "I read minds. I have read every mind I have come within 50 feet of since I was 23 years old. I did not read yours." "Ah," Harry tilted his head. "Yes, there is a discipline for that where I'm from. We call it a clumancy. It is mostly used by people with secrets to hide from people they hate, and I have, regrettably, become very good at it. It is not directed at you. It is in place at all times." "I can, if you would like, take it down." "No," said Edward, who did not, in his life, want to read the mind of someone who had described what Carlyle had just described to him over a kettle, and who could not, if he tried for 100 years more, have ever admitted that. "Then we'll leave it up." "You said you would put me across the parking lot." "I said if. I have not yet had to throw a vampire across a parking lot. I would like, in the long run, never to have to." "You think you could?" "Yes," Harry said simply. Edward held his gaze for a long beat, then he looked at the carpet. Then he looked at Carlyle. "I am not," Edward said, "going to apologize for asking. I would not have asked you to. I do not, however, believe him, Edward. I do not believe a small English boy in a coat from the second-hand shop can throw me across a parking lot. I have stood in front of a Volturi guard. I have stood in front of—" The teacup on the bookshelf was, very suddenly, a wren. It flew once around the room. It flew through Edward's hair. It hovered briefly by the window, and a small sound came from its small bisque throat that was almost the song of an actual wren. Then it was on the bookshelf again, and a teacup again, and quiet. Edward looked at the bookshelf. "All right," he said. "I believe him." Harry's mouth twitched. "Thank you," he said, "for being reasonable." Edward closed his eyes a moment. Carlyle watched him with a faint affectionate amusement, and after a moment laid one of his pale, fine hands against the back of his son's neck. Edward did not pull away. "I am sorry," Edward said. "It's all right." "I am very sorry." "It is genuinely all right, Mr. Cullen. I have had worse weeks. I can tell you about one of them, if you like, after Carlyle and I have agreed on what we are going to tell your family." It was in the back of a long stone audience hall that same evening that the man called James the Tracker was given his marching orders. He was a thin man with shoulder-length pale hair and the still, hungry face of a wolf in a snow clearing, and he was, at this particular moment, already partway across the world. He had, on instructions from the high table, been monitoring a particular small girl in a town in northwestern Washington for some weeks. He had been intending, for his own private reasons, to amuse himself with her. Arrow had, at the last possible moment, informed him that he might, through some indulgence, combine his amusement with a small additional task. The task was to look at the wizard, to look, not to touch. James had smiled when this last instruction was passed to him. Arrow had not smiled back. Arrow had laid one long pale hand on the man's wrist, and whatever Arrow had read there had made his eyes go briefly and distantly cold. The cold passed. The smile that followed was, again, small and gentle. "You will keep my rule," Arrow said softly. James. "Yes, master." "You will not touch the wizard." "Yes, master. You may, however, frighten the girl. We must not deprive you of all your pleasures, master. Demetri will know if you go too far, master." Arrow had let go of his wrist. James had bowed an old, mannerly bow, and had turned and walked out of the long stone hall. In the deep stone gallery behind the throne, in the half-light, Marcus Volturi had not moved. He had not, in fact, opened his eyes. He had not, for the most part, opened his eyes for several centuries. The world in front of his eyelids was not, on the whole, more interesting than the long, pale field of the dead behind them. He spoke, however, just barely audibly after Arrow had gone. "Brother," he said. Caius in the chair beside him did not turn. "Yes, Marcus. There is a young man in the west of America. I know, he is bound to many dead." "That is what Arrow said. He is bound to a great many dead, Caius. I have not seen so many in a long time. And Caius, when he is angry, he will be very dangerous." Caius's pale lip curled. "He is one wizard. He is bound, Caius. Bound. I do not mean to people, I mean to a thing." Marcus opened his eyes a small fraction. "I cannot quite see the thing. It is large, it is very large." "It is older than us." He closed his eyes again. "I wished only to mention it. You are tiresome, Marcus, Caius rose and went out. Marcus, alone in the dark, did not move for a long time. Then he said to no one, in a voice no one but the dead heard, "Be gentle with him, Arrow. He is bound to such a great many of mine." In Forks, in the small house on the ridge after the Cullens had gone, Harry stood for a long time at his front window with his palm flat on the cold glass. He had liked Carlyle. He had, despite himself, liked even Edward. He had, on his own porch, looked the question of the rest of his life in the face for the first time since the morning after the battle, and he had not flinched from it, and he had not run from it, and that was a small thing. That was, perhaps, a beginning. Far off in the trees at the bottom of his drive, beyond the wards, something he did not yet have a name for was passing on the wind. He did not, that night, sleep well. The rain came down all night. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Wolves at the door. The wards tripped at 3:20 in the morning. Harry had not been asleep. He had been lying on his back on the narrow bed in the upstairs room with his arms crossed under his head, watching the slow slide of the cedar shadows across the ceiling, thinking. He had been thinking, mainly, about Remus. Remus had a way of returning to him in the small hours, in the moments after a long, thoughtful day. Remus had always been the version of an adult Harry had wanted to grow up into, and Remus was no longer in the world, and the world had not, even now, quite finished noticing the size of that absence. The wards on the third layer hummed once, very softly, and then again. He was on his feet in a single movement. The wards he had set on the property were not the violent kind. He had not come to Forks looking for fights. The first layer was a kind of polite cough. It noticed when a thing not human stepped under the cedars and acknowledged the fact. The second layer was a small bell that rang in the bones of his ear. The third layer was the one that mattered. The third layer counted. The third layer, by the time he was halfway down the stairs, was telling him there were 3 of them, and that they had not yet crossed the line of the porch. He did not pull on a coat. He took the holly wand from the hook by the door. He kept it on a hook now, the way other men kept their car keys, and he opened the screen door and he stepped out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves. The night was clear in a way it had not been in the day. There was a moon out somewhere behind the trees in a thin, stretched shape, and the rain had stopped about an hour before, and the air smelled the way wet cedar smells when it has just stopped raining, green and clean and a little astonished. He walked to the edge of the porch and laid one hand on the upright that held the roof, and he waited. They came out of the trees. There were 3 of them. The middle one was the largest wolf he had ever seen, and that was a thing to say, having been raised in a country in which Hagrid's cousin had on one occasion sat on his foot. The wolf in the middle was the size of a horse. It was the color of dark pewter at the shoulders and softer underneath. The 2 flanking it were smaller, but only by a little. One was the deep brown of bracken, and the other was a kind of mottled gray-brown like the bark of a fir. They held the line at the bottom of the steps. They did not, Harry noticed at once, charge. They had stopped exactly at the edge of the third ward. The big one had its lips drawn back over teeth that would have been unsettling if Harry had been entirely unfamiliar with the ratio of jaw to skull on a magical creature, which he was not. He did not raise the wand. He set it very deliberately on the porch rail beside him. The big one's eyes followed the gesture. "Good evening," Harry said quietly in a voice pitched to carry. The big one's ears flicked once. "My name is Harry Black. I bought the Olsen place. I'm not your enemy." "I'm not anybody's enemy, in fact, except for 1 or 2 people 6,000 miles away who are no longer in a position to do me harm. I would prefer not to fight you." I think, if you'll allow me a moment, you'll prefer not to fight me either." The middle wolf, Sam, although Harry did not yet know his name, tilted its great head in the way a dog tilts its head at an unfamiliar word. "I knew a man," Harry said, "a long way from here who had a different kind of changing in him. He used to apologize for it before any conversation. He used to say, 'Sit on this side of the table, the wind is the other way.' He was the kindest man I've ever met. He was, latterly, my son's godfather. He died not long ago in a war that was not, on any honest accounting, his to fight. His name was Lupin." He let it sit. He did not know what it would do. He was, frankly, betting on a long shot that the long, courteous formality of his old defense against the dark arts professor had been, somewhere underneath, a thing the wolves themselves would recognize. The big wolf at the bottom of the steps stood up out of its crouch. The big wolf turned away. There was a small movement in the trees, and a moment of stillness, and the wolf came back, this time on 2 legs and in the form of a tall, broad-shouldered young man wearing only a pair of loose dark trousers cut off at the knee. His face had the long, carved planes of his nation in it. His eyes had the steady weight of an alpha. Harry recognized this kind of weight without having to be told. The other 2 wolves had not moved. "You're the one in the house," the man said. His voice was deep and even. "I'm Sam Uli. Harry, you smell of dead things, Harry. I have known," said Harry, "an unusual number of them. You have no fear of us. I have walked through worse forests." Sam looked at him a long moment and then nodded slowly the way a man nods when he has settled a question for himself. "Tell us," he said, "about Lupin. He was a wizard." "There are other wizards." "There are. Lupin was a particular kind, the other kind that shares woods with you." He carried the wolf. He did. He carried it badly by his own account. He carried it for 33 years. He used to take a potion the last few years that let him keep his mind in the change. He would go up onto the moors with another man, his closest friend in the world, who was a different sort of changer entirely. And they would go up onto the moors, and they would come down again the next morning none the worse, except for the cold and the mud and the small twigs in their hair. He laughed easily. He was a teacher. He was the second person in my whole life after my godfather who I had ever wanted to be. Harry paused. "You smell death on me. You smell him." "You loved him," Sam said. "Yes. That's a lot of dead on one man to smell of just one." "I have not made an honest count." Sam was silent. Behind him, the brown wolf's ears were forward. The wolf was listening with a quality of attention that suggested a person was pulling it up by the ears. The mottled gray wolf behind him had relaxed its stance by perhaps an inch. The big brown was trembling. Harry recognized the tremor as the kind that came of holding back a young man who had grown up too fast and wanted to be the one talking. "Jacob," Sam said without turning. The brown wolf's tail flicked once. "Phase," Sam said, "and behave." There was, again, a small movement in the trees. Out of it stepped a boy. He was perhaps 14 and built like a tall sapling, with the kind of restless, lean intelligence in his face that suggested a mother who had been a good talker. He was wearing only a pair of cutoffs that were a little too big for him. He had a wide, eager mouth, and his hands were already in his pockets in the way the hands of a clever boy go in his pockets when he is determined to behave. "Hi," said Jacob. "Hi, I'm Jacob. Harry, sorry. I have one question. Go on. What's it like?" "What's what like?" "Magic." Sam looked sidelong at him in the long, resigned way of an older cousin. Harry, despite himself, smiled. "It's a lot like this conversation," he said. Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's a lot like having something inside you that's wider than you and learning to use it without breaking the people you love." "Oh. That answer was not, I'm afraid, very practical." "No," said Jacob, "but I'll think about it." Sam laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy quieted. "Mr. Black." Sam said, "Harry, please. Harry, there's a treaty in this country between us and a particular family of leeches, the Cullens. You know them. We've met. You smell of them. They were polite to me. I was polite to them. I have not made any treaty with them. I've not made any treaty with anybody, in fact, except for one with the goblins of London, which involves my keeping out of vaults and dragons, both of which I am happy to do." Sam was quiet. Then he said, "We don't know what to do with you. You don't have to do anything with me. I am not asking to be a part of your country. I am not asking to be a part of theirs either. I came here, in fact, to be left alone. I have no objection to walking into town for a quart of milk and saying hello to your boy here in the supermarket. I have no plans whatsoever to make myself a problem. I will, in fact, do a small, inconvenient piece of work for you tonight as a gesture of goodwill. What kind of work? I will lift the wards I have placed over my property such that they will not, henceforth, recognize you as a thing to ring a bell about. Sam considered that for a long moment. You can do that? Watch. Harry took a half step back. He set both his palms flat against the wood of the porch upright. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds. He opened them. There, he said. That was nothing. That was, in fact, a very deliberate piece of nothing. Go and put your hand on my fence post and tell me what you feel. Jacob darted before either of his elders could prevent him. He bounded down the steps 2 at a time, ran across the gravel, slapped his palm against the leaning split rail and stopped and turned around with his face wide open. It used to hum, he said. Yes. It doesn't hum now? No, you took it off. I took the part off that was about you. I have a separate set in mind just for vampires. They do not seem to have minded coming up the drive on foot, and I think we'll let them. Sam looked at him and looked at Jacob and did not quite smile. But he did, after a moment, do a small thing with his shoulders that was not, for him, a kind of relaxation exactly, but was perhaps the next thing to it. Mr. Black, he said, Harry, we will not tonight be your enemy. Thank you, Sam. And tonight, Sam said, is in fact why we came. There was, Sam said, a fourth presence in the air that did not belong to the Cullens. He had been smelling it for 2 days. He had at first not known what to do with it. The leech was, Sam used the word leech deliberately in a flat voice that was not a slur and not a courtesy, simply a word. The leech was new. The leech smelled of 3 things. It smelled of the venom like all of them. It smelled of human blood drunk recently, which was a thing the Cullens did not smell of, and it smelled, distantly, of a third thing, which Sam had narrowed down by careful sniffing along the edge of the river to a kind of sweetness like a pile of incense outside a church door. That, said Sam, was an unfamiliar thing. He had not smelled it before. Harry, who had spoken at length with Carlyle about the Volturi the previous afternoon, set his teeth. It's a hunter, he said. Not one of theirs, an outside one lent to them. They've sent him. Sent him to do what? To look. They want me looked at. They want you eaten, you mean? They want the Cullens eaten. I'm a curiosity, Harry, said Sam, My pack is between this thing and the town. Yes, I have a little brother in this town. Bring him to mine, Harry said, or better. Bring him to Charlie Swan's and tell him you're worried about a man who drove away from the diner the wrong way and stay near the house. The chief is observant. He will keep him fed and watered and with a deputy outside until you can take him home. I will do the leech. Sam was silent. You will do the leech, he said. I will do the leech. Jacob, who had come back up the steps and was now, very carefully, standing 1 step below the porch, said, Have you done this before? I have not, in fact, done this exact thing before. Right. But I have done a great many things in the same general postcode. Right. It will be all right, Jacob. Sam put a hand on the boy's shoulder again. Jacob settled again. The big mottled gray wolf behind them, who had not phased and who was, as Harry would later learn, called Embry, gave a small sniff that managed to convey the opinion that the wolf in question would have preferred to be the one doing this. We'll take the southern run, Sam said. We'll keep the leech off the town. You take whatever line you want. I'll take the river. He'll come at the river first. I expect he will. We will not tonight, Sam said again. Be your enemy, I know. Sam stepped back off the porch. Jacob stepped back. The big mottled gray wolf wheeled once and disappeared into the trees in 2 long bounds, and Sam took a step back into the dark and was, in 3 breaths, the great pewter wolf again. Jacob last gave Harry a small, embarrassed, fierce wave with one hand and bounded down off the steps. He was gone before Harry could lift a hand to wave back. The wolves padded silently away across the gravel. Harry stood on the porch for a moment longer. He picked the holly wand off the rail. He dropped it into his sleeve. He did not, this time, take only the holly. He went back into the house, climbed the stairs 3 at a time, opened the closet, set his palm flat against the wards there. took the long, pale knobbed wand off the folded sheets and slid it down the inside of his other sleeve. He pulled on his coat. He walked out onto the porch, down off the steps and into the trees. A mile away on the muddy bank of the Kaliwa, James the tracker was crouched on a fallen log with his head cocked sideways, drinking with his nose. He had, by this time, very nearly decided that the wizard's presence was the kind of thing he wanted very badly to play with. Arrow had said look. Arrow was, however, 6,000 miles away. James thought to himself with a small private smile, never been entirely good at look. The girl was, in the end, only the bait. The wizard was the prize. He stood up off the log, wound his nose into the wind, and started moving. He did not know that the woods between him and the town had a thing in them tonight that was not quite, what he had been told. He had been told, in Arrow's careful voice, that the wizard was a curious item in a wet country. He had not been told that the wizard came through the cedars on foot, in a heavy cloth coat, with both hands empty at his sides, with his green eyes black in the dark. And with a long, pale wand of the kind not seen on earth between the fall of Britain to Rome and the morning Albus, Dumbledore had buried it in marble 4 months and 7 days before. He had not, in fact, been told a great deal he was about to learn. The two of them moved through the wet trees toward each other. They did not yet that night meet. The wolves caught a wind off the river and turned south, and James, who could smell them even at a quarter mile, peeled off east in a long, fast, careful arc, away from Teeth, toward the town, toward the girl. He did not know it yet, but he had been turned. He had been herded. He had begun, without realizing, to walk into a place a person had decided he would walk into. In the small house on the hill, Harry came back through the screen door an hour and a half before dawn, hung his coat on the peg, dropped his boots beside the stove, climbed the stairs, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed with his hands open on his knees. He had not, that night, killed anything. He had laid the lines down where he wanted them. He had time. The rain came down all morning. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The Volturi question. The Volturi did not, in the ordinary way, hold council. They lived in a high stone tower on the back of an older stone tower in a city whose foundations were Etruscan. And they sat, when they were not sleeping or hunting or reading or quarreling, in a long, pale audience hall with 3 thrones at the head of it. And Arrow and Caius and Marcus had occupied those thrones in that order from the center, for so long that the marble beneath the seats was worn into a small, unrepairable hollow under each. Visitors approached up the hall. Visitors departed back down the hall. There were small, comfortable footed cushions for the wives in a balcony to the left of the throne dais, although the wives, as a rule, found their own ways to amuse themselves. There was a stand for vases. There was an old narrow door in the back wall by which the guard, who liked to listen, generally did, that was, in normal times, all the counsel the Volturi required. Arrow had thought about it for 48 hours and had rung a bell. A bell ringing in the great tower had a particular quality. It was a small bell, a hand bell, of a kind smiths in Etruria had made before the consonant of Christ, and it had a small specific gold sound that traveled up and through stone in a way that bells of more recent kind did not. There were perhaps 348 people in the world who knew what it meant. By the time it had stopped ringing, 6 of them, the senior 6, the ones who could be brought home in under a day, were on aircraft from places as far apart as Reykjavik and Lima. That was the first sign Caius had that Arrow was, this time, not merely curious. "You are bringing them home," he said. All of them, from Lima as well." "Yes." They were in the long colonnaded gallery overlooking the Piazza dei Priori, a place of cool stone and old portraits and a small, austere fountain that had not run in 200 years. Caius wore his white cloak and his familiar narrow displeasure. Arrow wore a soft gray and a face on which the ordinary mannered sweetness had not, on this particular morning, settled in. "You are afraid of the wizard," Caius said. "I am cautious of the wizard." "That is the same thing." "It is not." "There are things I am cautious of which I am not afraid of, brother. The light from the moon, for instance, when I am crossing a bridge with a railing low enough that I might be seen. I am cautious of moonlight. I am not afraid of it. You are afraid. Very well, Caius, read it as you like. I am bringing them home. There was a silence. The fountain did not run. Somewhere below, a child was being rebuked by its mother in dialect. What if, Caius said, we were to descend on him at once? At once, all of us, the whole guard, tomorrow night, in Forks, Washington. In Forks, Washington? Arrow tilted his head. That would be a very expensive way of finding out whether or not he is, in fact, what I think he is. He is one wizard. He is not one wizard, Caius. He is one, let me see if I can phrase this, one of a wizard. I do not know what kind. I have spoken in some long evenings over the centuries to the careful old kind of wizard who has lived past his 170th year on the kind of magic that does not expand anymore. And I have on occasion looked into the minds of such persons and found that, even with my hand on theirs, I could not have what they kept. They kept it in a place I could not reach. Those wizards were not particularly afraid of me. They were, on the whole, polite. We left each other alone. Demetri tells me that the boy in Forks is younger than that and stronger and not, as it happens, polite. He does not bow. He does not, when he is thought about from a great distance, flinch. He is one wizard. You said that, brother, Arrow, Caius, Marcus has been muttering. Marcus mutters often. Marcus has been muttering since 1487. It is one of the things I love about him. Marcus said the wizard is bound to a great many dead. He did say that. What does it mean? I do not know. I did not at the time ask. I should have. It is, on reflection, the kind of thing it might be useful to know more about. I will go and see him this afternoon. Until I have a better answer than I have now, brother, I will not unleash you upon him with the whole of the guard. Because if you do not return, I will have lost not only an ancient friend, but also, Caius, an ancient friend. The corner of Caius's mouth went in the small particular way it went when Arrow had successfully slipped a kindness past him. You speak softly to me when you do not wish to be argued with, Caius said. It is my one trick, brother. You will allow me to come with you to see Marcus, of course. Marcus had been sitting in his quarters with the curtains drawn and a candle on the floor for 3 days. The candle was, of course, only there for the look of it. Marcus's eyes did not require candles. The candle was the way Marcus reminded himself that he was, in some sense, of a piece with the slow, thoughtful old practices of the men who had once worshipped at the temple under the city. The candle lit a small bowl with water in it. The water was for looking. It did not, in any practical sense, do anything. It was a black still surface that did not move and did not reflect particularly. And it was the kind of still surface a man who could see bonds between people might use to catch his attention and hold it until the bonds resolved. He looked up when Arrow and Caius came in. He did not stand, brothers, Marcus. Arrow sat on the low stone bench beside him. Caius stood at the door. I would like to know what you meant about the wizard's dead, You said he was bound to a great many. Yes. What does it mean, Marcus? Marcus looked into the bowl a long while. He had, in his time, when he had loved Didyme and before he had lost her, been a chatty companion. He had told long, witty, gentle, learned stories at table and had, on occasion, made even Caius laugh. He had not, for almost 1200 years, been any of those things. He was now, and had long been, a man whose only remaining native register was elegy. Bonds between living people, Marcus said quietly, are a kind of light. Some are small, steady candles, some are bonfires. I have been able to see them since I was made. There is a different kind of bond. It is a bond between a living person and a person who has died, where the living person carries the dead one, not metaphorically, brother. Materially. Where some small portion of the dead person is, in some sense, still inside the living one, because they were so loved that the loss of them did not all leave at once. I do not see this bond often. Most living men do not love anyone enough. I see. On the wizard, brother, there is quite a lot of this kind of bond. How many? I cannot count. I would guess 30. 30. He is 18. Bear that in mind. Arrow was, for him, slow to answer. He has lost 30 people he loved by the age of 18. He has lost 30 people he loved enough that some part of them is still in him. There may have been more he merely lost. Those would not show. I am speaking of the ones who would not, in any measurable sense, leave. That is a great deal. Yes. Marcus, what is the practical thing of it? Marcus closed his eyes. In the broadest sense, brother, he said, I will say this. A person carrying that many of the unleft is not, in any usual sense, alone. A person carrying that many of the unleft is, I would say, a small congregation. He is, brother, a place, many wills. Many of them angry on his behalf, many of them attentive. Many of them in some manner I cannot quite see loving. He cannot see them, perhaps, he can feel them. They are, brother, with him, I see. You should not, brother, send chaos after him with the full guard. Why? Because, brother, you will not be sending chaos after him with the full guard. You will be sending chaos after a small congregation of the unleft which has a wizard at the front of it. The wizard is, I think, only the speaker. There was a long silence in the small candle-lit room. Caius at the door said, That is theatrical. Marcus did not open his eyes. I was bothered by it, brother. Arrow stood up. He laid his hand on Marcus's very lightly. He read what Marcus had given him to read and gave back in the way of long brothers what he had and let go. I will go to him myself, he said. Will you? Marcus said. I will. Bring me a flower from his garden, brother. He has not yet planted a garden, Marcus. Then bring me one of the cedars. He will plant a garden in the spring. He is growing into the place. I can see this. All right, Marcus, you have not looked at the bowl in some time. I have not. Are you all right? Marcus opened his eyes. He looked for a long, fond moment at his oldest brother. The look in his face was the look of a man who had not, in 1200 years, asked anyone to help him. I am all right today, brother. Good. Halfway around the world in a kitchen in Forks, Esme Cullen was burning lasagna. She was burning the lasagna deliberately. Her family did not eat. None of her many decades of practice had made her good at the kind of cooking she had not had to do herself for 90 years. And there was a particular satisfaction. She had told Carlyle that morning, in the controlled disaster of producing a thing that smelled approximately right and was. If you scraped the bottom, edible. She had made lasagna. She had made bread. She had cut cucumbers into thin, papery slices in the way her grandmother had cut them in the small, hot kitchen in Columbus when she was 9. She had set out in candle holders that had not held candles in 100 years, 3 new white candles. She was making, in short, dinner. She stood at the window in the long, patient, still way that was her own and watched the river through the cedars. He will come, she said to no one. Carlyle, behind her, set his book down. Yes, he said, I think he will. He came at 6:05 in his beat-up green truck, with a bottle of red wine in one hand and a small folded coat over his shoulder, and Bella Swan in the cab beside him. He had, that afternoon, picked Bella up at the diner on her way home from school and explained in a low voice that he was going to dinner at the Cullens and that he thought, on reflection, she should come along. She had looked at him a long moment. Why, she had said. Because I think your friends should see, with you in the room, that I am, in fact, polite, and that I am not, in fact, intending to displace any of you in any way. Also, because I would like to introduce you to some new flavors of strangeness with my hand on your elbow rather than without it. It will be cleaner that way. Oh, she had said. You should come, yes, all right, she had said, as though she were considering a dare. Now, at the foot of the long, curved drive, with the headlights of the truck sweeping across white pillars and a porch as long as a railway carriage, and the kind of large, modern paned glass that was the architectural sign of either great wealth or great taste or both. Bella sat very still in the passenger seat with her hands clenched in her lap. You don't have to go in, Harry said. I do, though. You don't. I do. All right. He came round to her side and opened the door. He held out his elbow with a small, old-fashioned formality that would have been, on anybody else, faintly ridiculous and would have been, on him, almost affectation, and yet on him was, somehow, simply manners. She took it. He led her up the steps. The door opened before he had to knock. Esme stood in the doorway in a soft, pale green dress and an apron over it. She had set the apron there, Harry noticed instantly with a private warm amusement, on purpose. It was the gesture of a woman who had decided she was going to be a hostess and was going to lean into the thing all the way. Behind her, the great wide hall of the house went up 2 stories to a vaulted roof, and a fire burned in a stone hearth that was, Harry estimated, the size of a night bus. "Welcome," Esme said warmly, "both of you. Come in, please, the wine is—" "Oh, that's very kind of you, Harry, thank you, Bella, dear, you look freezing, give me your coat," and she swept them. The door closed behind them. Harry put his hand briefly to the small of Bella's back, the way an older brother might, and left it there for one breath. She looked at him sidelong, surprised, and felt, though she did not at the time have words for it, held. Dinner at the Cullens. It was, as a piece of theater, both extraordinary and entirely ordinary. They sat at the long, pale table, the 7 of them, plus Harry and Bella, under a low chandelier that had been bought in Vienna in 1864. Esme served the lasagna, badly, with magnificent ceremony. Carlyle poured the wine. Edward sat at the corner near Bella with a quiet, intent, distracted alertness that Harry noticed and did not, on this occasion, mind. Alice perched at the far end of the table with her chin on her fist and her dark eyes on Harry's face the entire meal, as if she were memorizing him for later. Jasper sat next to her, very still, very polite and breathing, Harry noticed through his mouth on Esme's instruction. Emmett drank the wine with relish and pronounced it good. Rosalie did not drink the wine. Rosalie did not speak. Rosalie, Harry noticed, looked at him twice with the blunt, cold candor of a beautiful woman who had decided in advance that she did not like him, and was prepared to revisit the decision later as a courtesy if it became inconvenient. The lasagna was very bad. Harry ate 2 helpings. Esme. He said at the close of the second, "This was lovely. I haven't sat at a table this size in some time." "Oh, you sweet boy, I mean it, you ate the burnt bit." "I am from Britain, Esme. We are bred for the burnt bit. We bake things to the point of charcoal and hand them to dinner guests with a small smile." She laughed. It was the first laugh in the room that came from below the diaphragm, and it pulled small smiles out of every face at the table, including Rosalie's, briefly, against her will. After dinner, when the others had drifted off, Alice and Jasper to a piano upstairs, Emmett to make Rosalie laugh out of doors with an elaborate and unnecessary chasing of a deer, Esme to clear the dishes that no one would eat. Carlyle took Harry into his study. And Bella sat on the long couch in the great room with Edward beside her and her fingers laced through his, and the fire in the great stone hearth went down slowly to red. In the study, Harry and Carlyle talked for 2 hours. They talked about the Volturi. Harry told Carlyle in plain terms what Carlyle had already begun to suspect, that one of them, probably Arrow, would come, and would come not with an army because it would, on first contact, look poor. They would come quietly. They would come with 1 or 2 attendants. They would come bearing a kind of gift, they always did. They would be in their way a polite and very dangerous embassy. "I should not be here," Harry said. "When they come for the first time, I want them to come for me, not to come for you. They will come for both of us. They will. But the courtesy will go better the first time if I am at home and not at table with you." "I agree. There will not be a second time of polite courtesy, Carlyle. I am sorry. I know, I am, in fact, very sorry." Carlyle laid his fine, pale hand over Harry's on the desk. The hand was cold. The hand was steady. "Harry," Carlyle said, "we have lived in this town for 10 years. We have built a life. We have built a small, steady, human-shaped life in plain sight, drinking the blood of mountain lions and listening to Esme practice the cello and watching Edward play his piano at 3 in the morning. We have done it because we believed, all of us, that we were not, in any final accounting, monsters, and that the universe was prepared to make a small bargain with us about that." He paused. "If the universe has now sent you to us, and the universe is requiring us to defend you from the kings of our own kind, that is what the universe is requiring, we will do it. We will not flinch. Carlyle, you did not ask. I am offering. I will not let you stand in front of me." "Of course not, but you will, perhaps, allow me to stand beside." Harry looked at him a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will." The fire went down to red. The wolves on their own ridge turned their ears north in Volterra. Arrow ordered his bag packed. The rain came down all night. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Old ghosts, the mirror called him on Thursday at 4 in the morning. He had been asleep for less than an hour. He had taken to sleeping less lately, by a kind of natural accommodation. The body that had survived the killing curse had a way of using sleep more efficiently than other bodies, and the mind in the body had a way of preferring to be awake at hours when nobody else wanted anything of it. He had been lying in the dark with his hands behind his head, listening to a small early bird in the cedars outside the window, when the small mirror on the bedside table thrummed. He picked it up. Hermione's face came into the glass. Her hair was up in a kerchief, and there was ink on her forehead, which had a way of getting there when she had been working for a long time, because she had a bad habit of tucking her quill behind her ear. The candle behind her was nearly out. Harry, Hermione, it's bad. Tell me. She had a way, when she was very upset, of laying out her thoughts in bullet points so that her voice would not crack between them. She used the way now. 1. Yaxley's old cell is now 37 people. They have sent me a list of names. 12 of them are dangerous. 4 of them are very dangerous. 2 of them I would not, under ordinary circumstances, attempt without you. 2. The new minister is in their pocket, slowly, not bought, frightened. The cabinet is split. Kingsley is no longer minister. He resigned 3 days ago. Why? Because he is good and the country is not, and he was in their way. Right. 3. We have Ron and I, we are doing our best. We have Neville and Luna and Ginny and Andromeda and a small number of the older Aurors who have not yet retired or been retired. We are tracking. We are not yet fighting. Don't come. I won't. I mean it. I won't. 4. Macusa, no, I'm sorry. They know you have not registered. Yes, you said in your letter. They have, this week, dispatched a senior investigator to Forks to interview you. Her name is Green, Cassandra Green. She is competent, she is honest, she is not a friend, but she is not corrupt. She will arrive within 48 hours, be polite. Please don't transfigure her into anything. I have never transfigured a person. You transfigured Malfoy into a ferret. I did not. That was Crouch. Don't be a pedant, Harry, be polite. Tell her enough to make her go away. If you give her enough, she will, on her honor, file you a quiet little file under Vermont 10C and bother nobody about you. If you are a brat, she will report you up. Don't be a brat. I will not be a brat. 5. There's a 5. There is, regrettably, a 5. There's a tracker in your country. Yes, you knew. Yes. I keep underestimating you. I shouldn't. He is being lent. He is on your side of the border at the request of a, what is the word, Volturi. Yes, that. Stay clear of him, Harry, please, until you are well rested. Hermione? Yes, he is hunting a girl I have begun to like. There was a small silence in the mirror. The candle behind Hermione gave a small last flare and went out, and her face was lit then only by the small, soft blue light of her wand tip held below her chin. Ah, she said, yes. Will you let him take her? No, I thought not. It will be done quietly. You will tell me when. I will tell you when. And Harry, yes. 6, Hermione, 6, I love you. Ron says hello, we are all right. Don't worry about us. Live, be alive, we will hold this country. All right. Do you understand me, Harry? Live? I understand you. The mirror went dark. He laid it down on the bedside table and lay back in the dark with his hands behind his head and listened to the small bird in the cedars. He thought, after a long while, of Bella in the truck, with her hands in her lap. He thought, longer than he would have liked to admit, of how she had looked at him when she had asked, of all the small, careful questions a girl in her position might have asked, only the question of whether he was going to be all right. The senior investigator from Macusa arrived in Forks at 3:20 on the Friday. She came as a tall, plain-faced woman in her early 40s in a navy raincoat and good walking shoes, and she introduced herself at the door of his house, with a small ID flipped open under her chin, as Special Investigator Cassandra Green of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. North Pacific Field Office. She had blunt-cut dark hair under a cap, the kind of practical hands that had done their own carpentry, and brown eyes set very wide apart. She looked, Harry thought immediately, like a woman who would have been a perfectly good Auror under Kingsley in the country he had left. Mr. Potter, she said. He did not pretend to be Mr. Black. He had this morning made the small private decision that, with this particular woman, he was not going to pretend to anything, Investigator, he said, would you like a cup of tea? I would, thank you. He let her in. He set the kettle on. He sat her in the cracked leather chair by the window. He poured her a cup. He sat opposite her with his own. They considered each other for perhaps a minute over the rim of their cups in the way two professionals consider each other when they have been sent to do the kind of work that two professionals can between them get done. So, she said, so. We have known you have been here, she said, for 9 days. That is fast. You are a popular boy. Yes, you did not register. No. Is there a particular reason? Several. Tell me one. My name on a list in the District of Columbia, he said. Would within 48 hours be on a list in London, within 72 hours in the hands of someone in London who is reorganizing the survivors of the recent unpleasantness. I would prefer not. That is, in principle, an answer. It is, in principle, a true one. You are not in D.C., Mr. Potter. You are in Olympia, and Olympia is ours, not theirs. With great respect, investigator, I have spent the last decade of my life learning that the difference between agencies that are ours and agencies that are theirs is, frequently, only the color of the parchment. She considered him over the rim of her cup. There was a very small smile in the corner of her mouth that she had not yet decided whether to permit. She decided. The smile came up. I have, she said, thought that at points. I did not mean to insult you. You did not. She set her cup down. Mr. Potter, this is going to sound strange, given what I have just said, we are broadly on your side. The president is not a fool. The director is not a fool. There are not, in Macusa, the sort of arrangements there have been historically in the Ministry of Magic. We have, on the whole, learned from one or two of you. The president, in fact, on hearing that you had landed in Forks, said the following thing, which I will repeat to you because I think you deserve to hear it. She cleared her throat. He said, and I quote, that boy has done enough, leave him alone unless he asks, end quote. Harry blinked. That is the president of Macusa? That is the president of Macusa, he said it himself. He said it himself, out of his own mouth. Out of his own mouth in front of 3 witnesses, one of whom was me. That is generous. He is a generous man. There was a qualifier. Of course there was. The qualifier was, paraphrasing. But if he so much as breathes a word of magic in front of a no-mage who has not been previously cleared to know about magic, fine him 1,000 dragons and ask him to go home. That qualifier I will, however, sit on if I am persuaded that the relevant breach is not occurring. He took that in. You are looking the other way. I am looking the other way, she said, if I have something to look at on the other way. What do you need? I need a piece of paper that says what you are doing in the United States and who you are doing it with. I need a name and a contact. I need, frankly, a Cullen. I would prefer, if it can be arranged, Carlyle. Carlyle is known in the office. Carlyle has, on at least 4 occasions in the last decade, put himself out for our personnel. He has, Mr. Potter, more than once put a fang into a vein in front of a no-mage on our behalf. He is not technically registered with us because vampires can't be, but he is on a list of names which we hold internally as friendlies. All right. If you tell me you are with Carlyle, and if Carlyle tells me he is with you, and if I file that, the file will go into a drawer and the drawer will be locked and the key will be lost on the way to my office. That is generous again. It is not generous, Mr. Potter. It is institutional self-interest. You are, frankly, a person we would prefer not to have to confront. We are too small a country and you are too large a wand. Understood. She set down her empty cup. He took it, refilled it without rising, set it back at her elbow. She took the small refill in her stride. She had been told in advance in a brief that had been shared with her by a colleague who knew the relevant mechanic, what kind of refill to expect. There is one other thing, she said, of course. There is a tracker in your county. I know. He is, technically, not within our remit. He has not, on our soil, harmed any no-mage that we are presently aware of. That will, I think, change in the next 24 hours. I think it might. If it does, we will, of course, be obliged to do something about it. I will, of course, save you the trouble. There was a small, careful pause. She inclined her head. That is, she said, what I came to hear. I thought it might be. I will be in Olympia for 2 more days, she said. I will be at the Hilton on Capitol Way. If you need to find me, leave a note at the front desk for Green. After that, I am gone home to the office. Do not, please, find a reason to write to me at the office, because I would prefer not to know. Understood, Mr. Potter, investigator. Be careful. I will be. She rose, set her cup on the table, and let herself out. The screen door swung closed behind her. He heard her footsteps go down the porch and across the gravel and away. He sat in the cracked leather chair for a long time. He did not finish his tea. He thought mainly of how well things had gone with her, and of how well things rarely went, and of the shape of the rest of the day. He stood up. He went into the kitchen. He pulled the wand from his sleeve. He opened the closet. He opened the small ward in the back of it. He took out the long, pale wand and slipped it into his other sleeve and shrugged his coat on over it and went out. It was, by then, 4 in the afternoon. The light over Forks was the long, flat pewter that meant rain in the next hour and a low ceiling all night. He drove the truck the long way down the gravel and turned west on the highway and headed for the river. James the tracker had come by that hour to a small clearing in the woods east of the school. He had all afternoon been hunting Bella. He had taken his time. He had liked very much the parts of his trade that involved patience. He had not, in his mortal life, had patience, and he had, over a couple of centuries, taught himself the pleasure of it the way some men taught themselves the pleasure of fishing. He had been moving in a long, careful spiral around her. He had been smelling her, at noon when she had walked from her father's truck to the door of the school with her bag on her shoulder. At 1 when she had eaten her sandwich at a long, pale table in a cafeteria he could not enter without combusting. At 2 when she had stepped out the back door of the gym and stood for 30 seconds in the doorway with a small, private smile on her face that had caused, in him, an idle, jealous spike. Now, at 4, he had come to the clearing because the wind was coming through it from the north and he wanted to taste her on it before he made his approach. He had not, until that exact moment, thought about the wizard at all. The wizard had occupied in his thinking a kind of distant scheduled appointment. He had been told to look. He was going to look. He had been told not to touch. He had been planning, in fact, to touch, because he had been, the entire flight from Italy, a little bored with the careful courtly respect Arrow had given the wizard's name. He had wanted to test the wizard's name in a way that would, when he reported back to Arrow, make Arrow understand that in a question of who was the gentleman and who was, in the end, the dangerous animal in the woods, James was and would always be the dangerous animal in the woods. He had planned to touch her first. He had planned only at the last minute to introduce the wizard to the situation as what was the word, incentive. He stepped into the clearing. The wizard was already there. He was sitting on a stump in the middle of the clearing in a long, heavy coat with his hands open on his knees and his head a little tilted, and he was looking at James with a kind of polite, unsurprised attention, as though James had been precisely on time for a meeting. "Good afternoon," said the wizard. James did not, on principle, greet his prey. It struck a kind of unfortunate note. He stood very still on the verge of the clearing instead, with his hands at his sides, and let his eyes adjust to the light and took stock. The wizard was 18 or 19. The wizard was thin. The wizard was unimpressively tall. The wizard had no fewer than 13 visible scars on the parts of him James could see, which was the throat and the back of the wrists and the bridge of the nose. The wizard's eyes were green. The eyes had the alertness of a thing that was, in some sense, in charge. "You are a long way from home," said the wizard. "You are also a long way from home," said James. "I am, in fact. We could discuss it." "I think I will not." "I think you might want to." James moved. He moved at the speed at which his kind moved. He covered in a single bound the length of the clearing, and he did not, on his way, take what was in front of him entirely seriously, because he had drunk in his life the blood of a senior Volturi guard who had thought herself untouchable. And there was nothing about a thin English boy in a coat that he had any particular reason to take seriously yet. He found, on the way through the air, that the air had changed. It had thickened. It had become, over the 3rd foot of his bound, a kind of clear gel, and then, over the 5th foot, a clear, hard, unmoving glass. He had not, in 80 years, been physically prevented from moving toward a thing he had decided to move toward. The experience was new. The glass held him. He hung in midair, head forward, hands at his thighs, mouth open in the start of a snarl. "Sit," the wizard said kindly. James was, in the next moment, on the ground. He did not get up. He could not. There was a shape over him. He could not see the shape, but he could feel the shape. It had a weight on it, and the weight was something between a hand and a glass plate, and it had pressed him to the earth in such a manner that his arms were at his sides and his face was turned to one side. And he could feel each individual blade of grass pressing into his cheek. He could not move. The wizard sat down across from him on the stump. "Now," the wizard said in the same gentle voice, "I am going to put a few questions to you." "You are going to die," said James to the grass. "It seems unlikely." "Arrow will." "Yes," said the wizard. "I expected he might. I think he will be cross with me, in fact." You cannot." "I can, however, James. Your name is James. I think I can ask you a question first. Do you, of your own initiative, intend the girl Bella Swan harm?" There was a long silence. "Yes," said James, because he had not, in 80 years, learned how to lie to a thing he could not move under. "I see. I would say, in fairness, that I had given you the chance to lie. I had not, however, given you that chance, and I had decided in advance that lying about that particular question would have made the next thing I am going to do go a little easier on me. You have, in your honesty, made it a little harder. I am, on the whole, willing to accept the inconvenience." "You will not." "I will." James, in the long second before it happened, got out, with very great effort, what would prove to be the last word he ever spoke. He got it out into the grass, between his teeth, into the wind. The word was, "Please?" The wizard heard it. The wizard's mouth, which had been kind, did not change, although the eyes darkened a little. The wizard nodded once, as though to a colleague. The wizard set the heel of one hand, gently, on James's collarbone, and a small, fast white light went into the chest of the man who had killed 87 people in his time on Earth, and the chest of the man came, all at once, apart like a piece of cold, dropped fruit. The pieces went very still. The wizard sat back. He looked at the pieces a moment. He raised one hand, palm up, and a small, fast, hot, bright thing came down through the trees and landed on the pieces and ate them. The wizard sat on the stump with his hands open on his knees. The bright, hot thing ate. The bright, hot thing finished. The bright, hot thing went out where James had been. There was a small black patch on the grass. It rained. The black patch in 2 minutes was nothing. The wizard rose. He walked to the edge of the clearing. He stood for a moment with his hand on the trunk of the nearest cedar, and he breathed in the smell of wet bark, and he turned his face up into the rain and let it land on his face for 30 seconds. Then he wiped his face on his sleeve, and he walked out of the clearing and back to the green truck on the muddy verge of the highway, and he drove the long road home. He did not, that evening, eat. He sat at the small kitchen table in the dark, with his hands flat on the wood, and let the dark settle around him. The Cullens, who came up the drive an hour later in their long, quiet line, found him there. "It's done," he said when Carlyle came in and sat opposite him. "Yes," said Carlyle. "We saw the ash?" he asked at the end. "Yes." He had killed 87 people, Carlyle. "Yes," he still asked. "Yes." "It does not, I find, get easier." "No, Harry, it does not." The wolves on La Push, who had been running the southern line, turned for home an hour later with their ears down. They had smelled the smoke. They had not crossed the ridge to look. They had sent, instead, the youngest of them in human form to tap on Harry's window in the morning with a paper bag of warm bread that Sam's wife had baked. The bread had been good. The boy had not stayed. In Volterra, Arrow stood up from a long table at which he had been writing and tilted his head and laid down his pen. "Demetri." "Master, I have lost my tracker." "Yes, master, that is, earlier than I had planned." "Yes, master." Arrow's face did not, on the whole, change. The smile was as gentle as it had been all morning. He folded his pen into a small wooden box. He put the box on the desk. He laid one hand very softly on the lid. "Pack the guard," he said. "The rain came down all night." Chapter 7 and Chapter 8. The Master of Death. They came up the drive the next afternoon, all of them at once, on foot, as Carlyle had taught them to come up that drive. Carlisle in front, Esme just behind his shoulder, Edward and Bella next, Alice and Jasper after them, Emmett and Rosalie last. They left the cars at the bottom by the leaning fence. They walked through the cedars in a long, careful, formal line. They came up onto the porch. Harry was waiting. He had not, that morning, drunk anything but water. He had not eaten breakfast. He had taken the holly wand from the hook by the door and laid it in his lap, and he had taken the long, pale wand out of the closet and laid it on the low table beside him, and he had drawn a small, thin line of chalk on the inside of the doorway over the place where his fingers had rested. The way Hermione had once drawn a line of chalk on the inside of the doorway of a tent in a wood that had not protected them and would not protect anyone, and which had nonetheless been a comfort. He had then sat in the cracked leather chair by the window with his hands open on his knees. He had not slept. When they were all inside, when the screen door had closed behind Rosalie, who closed it last with her cool, deliberate care, when Esme had laid a small bag of bread on the kitchen counter without comment, when Bella had taken off her wet jacket and hung it on the peg over Harry's dripping coat with a small touched gesture, when Carlisle had set himself down on the low couch with his hands folded on his knees, Harry looked at them all in turn. He had decided in the long blue night that he was going to tell them. He had decided in the long blue night that he was tired of holding it alone. "Sit," he said, "all of you, I am going to tell you a story." It took 2 hours. He told it without ornament, in the bare, even voice he had used at Hermione's mirror in the dark. He told them about a country in which there were people like him, organized into a ministry and a school and a long, foolish, brilliant, wretched system of customs that, in the main, did not work. He told them about a man called Tom Riddle, who had been, in his youth, the brightest student of his generation, and who had decided, partly out of a fear of dying that was perhaps 1 part fear of his own death and 2 parts contempt for his mother for having died first, to make himself impossible to kill. He told them how Riddle had done it. He told them about a soul and how a soul could be split. He told them about Horcruxes. He laid the word down on the floor between them like a thing he was glad to be done with. He told them about a prophecy. He did not pretend to think prophecies meant much. He had, on reflection, come to think of them as a polite frame placed by the universe over a thing that was going to happen anyway. He told them about a small house in Godric's Hollow and a green light and a 15-month-old boy who had not died. He told them about the Dursleys. He told them, at this point, less than he could have. He had no patience for self-pity. Hermione had once told him that he could afford a little. He had not, at the time, taken the advice. He was, however, taking it now by allowing himself to say in a flat voice the words, "They hated me," and to leave that as the description and to move on. He told them about Hogwarts. He told them, in the kind of voice that lived ribs deep, about the people at Hogwarts. He told them about Ron and about Hermione and about Hagrid. He told them about Dumbledore in a voice he had not been able to make, even because he was not yet, in any manner he could quite name to himself, finished with Dumbledore. He told them about Sirius. He told them about Remus, who they had heard of already from the wolves. He told them, this time, about Remus's dead face on a stone in the great hall, and about the small child Teddy, who had pink-bird hair and a habit of blowing bubbles into his porridge and had been left at 3 weeks old, with a grandmother who had buried, in 8 days, her husband and her daughter and her son-in-law, and was not yet finished with grief enough to cry in front of her grandson. He told them about Fred Weasley, in the voice of a man saying a name in a church. He told them about the war. He told them about the camping in the wood and the locket and the sword of Gryffindor and the dragon. He told them about Gringotts in a voice that was nearly amused. He told them about the Battle of Hogwarts in a voice that had no amusement in it at all. He told them about a forest he had walked into expecting to die. He told them about a King's Cross station kind of place, in which Dumbledore had spoken to him with the fond, patient regret of an old chess teacher, and about coming back. He told them about the man with no nose with red eyes in the dust in the broken hall. He told them about the disarming spell that had ended a war. He told them about the silence after. He told them, finally, about 3 particular objects. He stood up. He walked across the room to the bookshelf and picked up something in his palm. "There are," he said, "in our country, 3 objects which are old enough that the people who made them have, by now, almost certainly been forgotten by everyone who was at the time alive. They are called, when they are called anything at all, the Hallows. There are stories about them, children's stories. There is a tale we tell our smaller children at bedtime in which 3 brothers go up a road and they meet death, and death gives each of them a thing. The first brother gets a wand, the second brother gets a stone, the third brother gets a cloak. The first brother is killed for the wand. The second brother dies of his stone. The third brother lives a long, easy, useful life, and at the end of his time hands the cloak to his son and goes to meet death in the story like a friend." The Cullens were perfectly still. "It is, of course," Harry said, "only a children's story." He held out his hand and opened it. In his palm there was a small, smooth, black stone. It was not impressive. It had a thin, pale crack running across the top of it like a hairline scratch. He turned it 3 times in his fingers. He set it back in his palm. The room got darker, very gently, as though dusk had moved 1 step in. "Sirius," he said, in a voice that was almost a question, a man in a long black coat and the face of a 40-year-old who had laughed with his teeth in him, stepped out of the air at his elbow. He had bright, fox-like, kind eyes. He laid a hand very lightly on Harry's shoulder. He looked around the long, pale room with the candid amusement of a man who had not been surprised by anything in some time. "Well," he said, "bloody big house, isn't it?" "Sirius," Harry said. All right, don't get sentimental. Hi, kid, hi to all of you." He said to the room in general with a small, ironic small wave. "I am, regrettably, dead. He brought me out for this. Hello, doctor. Hello, Edward, I am told. Hello, lady with the very good cheekbones. I am Sirius Black, formerly of Grimmauld Place, formerly of His Majesty's Prison Azkaban, currently of the Long Peace. Don't worry, I am not staying." Bella, on the couch, made a small, inadvertent sound that was not quite a laugh. Sirius, across the room, lifted his head and looked at her, and something on his face went very small and very gentle. "Hello, miss," he said. "He's a good boy, don't worry about him, we're all of us with him. He just hasn't been able to look at us for long enough to notice." "I look at you." Harry said. "You look at me, briefly, out of the corner of your eye, as though if you turned to face me I would shatter. I will not shatter, Harry. I am dead. I am not on the whole ruinable from here." "Sirius." "Yes. Are you all here?" Sirius's mouth quirked. "Try us." Harry turned the stone in his fingers a second time. A woman in a long, pale dress stepped out of the air on his other side. She had Lily Evans Potter's small, thin, sharp face and Lily Evans Potter's red hair, and she did not, when she looked at her son, do anything as small as smile. She put her hands on his face. Her hands were not cold and they were not warm, they were, somehow, light. "Hello, my love," she said. "Mum." "Hello, my love, my love. Oh?" A man who had Harry's exact, untidy black hair stepped out of the air behind her, with his hands in his trouser pockets and a look that made him perhaps 23 years old, and put his hand on Lily's shoulder. James Potter looked his son in the eye, and Harry looked back, and neither of them, for a long moment, said anything at all. A long, thin, tired man with an old, kind face and a small gray beard came out of the air beside the bookshelf, leaned on it, lifted one hand briefly to Carlyle as a doctor's hello to a doctor across the centuries, and looked with a very small, unmistakable smile of approval at the room. "Well," said Remus Lupin, "he's in good company, Remus. Hello, Harry. Hello, Remus." The dead in the room looked, on the whole, calmly at the Cullens. They did not glow, they did not, in any of the ways stories had got into Bella's head about ghosts, hover. They stood in the room as though they had been invited to a small good party. They were, in some manner Bella did not yet understand, here. Carlyle Cullen had risen, very slowly, to his feet. He had been a man, Carlyle, who had not believed in souls when he had been a young pastor's son, and had then, somewhat against his will, concluded over a long lifetime that in fact he could not entirely rule them out, and had then, somewhat against his will again, concluded over a long unlife that in fact he hoped very much they existed, because the alternative was that he had been, for 270 years, only the venom and the cold. He had been, in a way that none of his family knew, an old, quiet, patient theologian. He stood up now in the long, pale room, and his face did the small, particular thing that Esme alone had seen it do twice in her century with him. And he said, with a small, dry break in his voice that was as close as he came in his mature life to weeping, "Oh, Doctor." Said Sirius with a small bow, "Good to meet you. And you, Mr. Black, likewise." Lily, with her hands still on Harry's face, said, "Carlyle, yes, Carlyle, yes, you are kind to my boy. He is, yes," she said with a small wet laugh. "Yes, he is, thank you." Esme put her hand against her own mouth. Bella, who had not moved, made a small low sound that came from her belly, and Edward, beside her, very carefully, took her hand. Harry closed his fingers on the stone. The dead, very gently, were not there. The room came back up to its ordinary weight, the way a chest comes back up off a tide. He set the stone back in the small box he had taken out of his pocket, and he laid the box on the low table, and he sat down in the cracked chair. Nobody spoke. After a long time, Bella said, very small, "Does it ever stop hurting?" He looked at her. "It stops being the only thing," he said. She nodded, her eyes were full. He made a small movement that might, in a less self-controlled man, have been the start of a kind of shrug. I am not telling you this to perform it. I am telling you because the next visit I am going to receive is from a man who would like me to choose between joining him and being made to join him, and I would like, when that visit occurs, for the people in this room to know exactly what they are agreeing to stand near." "We're standing near," said Carlyle. "You don't have to. We are, Carlyle, we are, Harry, all of us." There was a small silence. "Even me," Rosalie said in a flat, surprising voice. Edward, Carlyle, and Esme all looked at her. "What?" she said. "He took dinner with my husband and pretended to like the wine. I owe him—" Emmett, beside her, gave a single small bark of laughter. Bella laughed, a small wet laugh. The mood in the room gentled, very slightly. Harry told them then about the wand. He did not, unlike with the stone, demonstrate it. He did not, in fact, take it out of the closet. He told them instead what it was. He told them the story of the wand of Antioch Peveril, and the story of how that wand had, by long ill manners and by the violence of the men who had wanted it, been called the Elder Wand, and the Death Stick, and the Wand of Destiny, and several other foolish names, and how it had passed, in the very recent past, to him, by means of a small clean disarmament in a corridor that he did not then know was significant. He told them how he had laid it in marble, and how it had refused to stay laid. He told them how he had carried it since with him. "I do not particularly want it," he said. "I have decided, in fact, that I would prefer not to have it. I have not, however, found a way of making it leave me. I am, accordingly, settling for being its master." "What does that mean?" Carlyle said carefully. "It means," Harry said, "that I have not, since the morning after the battle, lost a duel. It means, additionally, that I think no living thing would beat me in one. I am, Carlyle, I am sorry, but I am being honest. I am the strongest wizard alive. I would like that fact to be on the table when we discuss Arrow." "That is on the table," Carlyle said. He told them last about the cloak. He took it out of the small bag at the bottom of the stairs and showed it to them and let Esme touch the hem of it. He did not put it on, he folded it back into the bag. "It is the last one of the three," he said. "It is the only one I would keep of choice. The other two I would, given a choice, leave behind. The cloak was my father's. It was his father's 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 father's, and so on for a great many fathers. It is family. It is not, in the way the wand is, a power. It is a comfort. It is, however, the third," said Carlyle very quietly, "and they go together. They do. And when one carries all three, one is, by tradition, called the Master of Death." There was a long silence. "I am sorry," Harry said. "It is a great big stupid title. I did not particularly want it. There are days when I dislike it intensely." "Are you," Esme said, "the Master of Death?" "It looks as though I might be," he said. "I have, on the whole, decided not to inquire too carefully into what it means in practice. In practice, it appears to mean that I do not, generally, die when killed, and that the dead I knew can speak to me when I trouble them, and that on certain particular occasions, when I am, for instance, being shot at by a great many people at once, A small, quiet kind of attention seems to be paid to me by something I do not have a word for. I do not pretend to understand it. I am the master of nothing, Esme. I am the holder of 3 uncomfortable old objects. I would like them to be the 3 least interesting things about me. I am going to try in the next few months to make them so. Harry, Esme said. Yes, will you stay for dinner? He blinked at her for a long second in the way of a man who had not expected a kind question that small. Yes, he said, I would like that very much. Will you eat the lasagna? You are not allowed to make lasagna again, Esme. I am making lasagna, Esme. I have the noodles already. I will eat the lasagna, he said gravely. You are very kind, she smiled. Edward, beside Bella, looked across the room at Harry and did, for the first time since the parking lot, the small particular thing with his eyes which on him meant, I see you. Harry saw the thing. He did not, on the whole, show that he had seen it because they were, neither of them, the sort of men who acknowledged such things directly. But his shoulders eased by a small, careful inch against the back of the chair. They ate that evening in the small kitchen around the table, with the rain on the metal roof and the cedars going dark beyond the windows. Esme's lasagna was, again, very bad. Harry had 3 helpings. That night, when they had all gone, he stood on the porch and watched their cars pull away down the long gravel track in a slow, careful line. He felt, behind his ribs, the small congregation of his unleft go quiet, the way a crowd in a square goes quiet when a flag is being lowered for the night. He felt, more specifically, his godfather's hand on his shoulder for a long second, and then it was gone. He went inside. He climbed the stairs. He slept 7 hours in Volterra on the same hour the Volturi guard finished packing. The rain came down all night. Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. Volturi strike. They came, in the end, in winter. The first snow had fallen the week before, a small, dry kind of snow that did not stick on the cedars and did not ever, in those latitudes, come up over the ankle. Forks did not, in the strictest sense, get a winter. It got a wetter version of the rest of the year. The cedars went on being cedars. The mist over the river went on being mist. The light, which had been pewter all autumn, had begun to slide a little toward iron, and the days, by mid-December, had fallen down to the kind of lean, dim blue afternoon in which the sun became, for the people of Forks, more an idea than an actual presence. They came on the longest night of the year. Arrow had a sense of these things. He had lived long enough that the long old human reverences had attached themselves to him, in the way that long old reverences attached themselves to anyone who lived a long time in a country whose churches stood on the foundations of older temples. He had said to Caius, in a small, mannered voice, that the night was one with a long history, and that he wished his entrance into the wizard's country to be met by the kind of night which a wizard might himself have chosen for the meeting. Caius, who did not, on the whole, share his brother's affection for such gestures, had nonetheless not argued, because the night also had the practical advantage of being some 17 hours long. They came up the long highway from Olympia in 3 black cars. They did not, this time, come unarmed. Harry had been ready for a fortnight. He had made changes to the wards. He had, after long talk with Carlyle on the porch in the iron blue light, drawn a long, careful, invisible line at the boundary of his property which would, if a thing came across it without his consent, ring a bell loud enough to wake every wolf on the reservation. He had, with a small, specific, and slightly improper bit of work, set every piece of metal in his house, the kettle, the iron skillet, the 4 nails in the back step, to come when called to his hand. He had set, on the rim of his garden, a circle of stones the size of his palm, which he could, with one word, make into things that flew. He had spent 2 long afternoons practicing the shapes the stones turned into when called, and had settled, eventually, on hawks. The hawks were not quite real. They were, however, unhappy enough about the shape. They had been put into to attack anything in their vicinity that did not belong to him. He had, with the wolves, walked the line. Sam Uli had stood for a long time on the ridge above the property in human form, with his arms folded. The wolves had argued about coming in that long, gentle, considering way Sam's pack had. Some of them had wanted to stay out of it. Most of them had wanted to come. In the end, Sam had said because Harry had asked, "We will come if it is on our side of the river. If it crosses, we cross. We will, if it spills onto your gravel, hold your gravel. But we will not, Harry, and I want you to be clear on this, be your weapons. We are not your soldiers. We are your neighbors. You are our neighbor. We come because of that. I know. I do not want this fight. Neither do I. Then let us please win it quickly." Yes, Jacob had grinned at him foolishly, and Harry had grinned foolishly back. Hermione had, 10 days before, sent a small package by Muggle airmail. It had been wrapped in a tea towel that smelled faintly of the burrow. He had taken the tea towel off and laid it on the kitchen counter for a long minute before he had opened the parcel. Inside the parcel, in a small velvet bag, there was a thing he had not expected. It was a phoenix feather. It was the feather of the phoenix fox, which had been sent to him with a small handwritten note in McGonagall's hand. He left this on the windowsill in the headmaster's office 4 days ago. "I think he meant it for you. I think he is, as ever, well informed." He had held the feather for a long time. He had then sat down at the kitchen table, taken out his holly wand, and worked the feather with extraordinary care into the center of the holly's grip with a small fine bit of charm work that took him 3 hours and bled him from a finger he did not bother to mention to anyone. The wand, when he had finished, was no longer the holly wand. It was a weapon. He laid it back on its hook and took the long pale wand from the closet and held the two of them, one in each hand, and looked at them in the lamplight and laid them down together on the counter. And he stood for a moment with both palms flat on the wood and breathed out. He was at last ready. The bell on the long invisible line rang at 4:15 in the morning. It rang in the bones of his ear and in the bones of every wolf within a 5-mile radius, and a moment later it rang, distantly, in Carlyle Cullen's hearing in his study, where he had been pretending to read a book. "They are here," Carlyle said. He did not need to say it. Edward had heard the same bell. Esme had heard the same bell. Alice, who had been pacing a small specific oval of carpet in the great room for 3 hours, stopped and stood very still and said with a small, dry, brittle confidence, "Now." "All of you," Carlyle said, "to the cars." They went. Harry, on his porch, was already there. He had pulled on his coat. He had pulled on his boots. He had, in the kitchen, very deliberately eaten a piece of toast. The cars came up the long gravel track in a slow, steady, measured line. They stopped in the careful old courtly Volturi way at the leaning split-rail fence at the bottom of the drive, and the doors of all 3 of them opened at exactly the same moment, and the people inside came out without hurry. Arrow came first. He wore a long black coat over a white shirt and the kind of polished boots that did not, for him, need polishing. His hair was as long and milk-white as it had ever been. His face had the small, considering expression of a man who had come across a continent to look at a painting and was prepared, on first inspection, to be polite about it. Caius came next. He wore white. He did not pretend to be polite. Marcus came third. He wore gray. He looked, on the whole, very tired. Behind them came the wives, Athenodora and Sulpicia, and a third Harry did not yet know was Didyme, alive in this particular crooked accident of an alternate world, not killed by arrow for love-loss insurance. Because in this small private branch of the world she had survived him by a hair's breadth and made him sentimental about her ever after, and behind the wives came the guard. The guard came in their own old gentle order. Renata at Arrow's elbow, Demetri behind Renata, Felix to Caius's right. Santiago to Caius's left, Jane and Alec, the small pale twins, at the center, hand in hand, Chelsea, the binder, behind them, Corin, the contented, behind her, Heidi at the rear with her long dark hair down. 20 in all, in the long old ordered way the guard came when the masters came in person. They walked up the gravel. They did not stop until they were 10 yards from the porch. "Mr. Potter," said Arrow, in a voice that was, despite the snow on the air, perfectly warm. "Mr. Volturi." "That is a poetry I have not been called by in some time. I beg your pardon." "Oh, no, I rather like it." "It is a kind of homage. May I come up and shake your hand?" "You may not." "Ah, I am, with great respect, aware of the gift in your fingers, Arrow. You will not be putting your hand on me. I do not, in fact, intend to ever shake the hand of a Volturi. That is not, I'm afraid, a friendly position to take. It is the position I take." Arrow's small, pleasant smile did not falter. He inclined his head with a small, generous bow that conveyed his readiness to forgive any number of small social rudenesses in pursuit of a pleasant evening. "Very well, Mr. Potter, then I will simply tell you from where I stand what I have come to say. I have come on the longest night of the year with my brothers and my wives and my dear guard on a long journey across the world to ask you to consider." The Cullens came up out of the trees behind him in a long, careful line. The wolves came up the slope of the ridge to his left in a long, deeper line. Arrow paused, with his hand still extended. He turned his head. He took in the Cullens. He took in the wolves. He took in the very last second in the way a man on a bridge takes a step back from a railing, a small further inhale. "Ah," he said very softly. "Carlyle, old friend." "Arrow," Carlyle said civilly, "you have, I see, come down on a particular side." "I have." "I am a little disappointed, brother." "I am very sorry, brother." "And you," said Arrow mildly to Sam, who had come to the front of the wolf line and was standing in human form with his arms folded across his bare chest, "will be the chief of our friends in La Push. We have not been previously introduced. I have heard of you. I am charmed to make your acquaintance." "Get off our country," said Sam. Arrow smiled. "I will shortly. The matter at hand does not, however, primarily concern you. Mr. Potter, Arrow, come with me back to Volterra, would you? I will give you on the journey the long, fine reasons I had prepared. You will join on arrival my dear permanent guard. You will be— No, Mr. Potter, I have not yet. No, my friend, you have not heard my offer. I do not need to. I am 18 years old. I have spent the larger half of my life hearing offers of that shape. I have every time said no. I will this time say no. I have, after some time, become rather good at saying no, Arrow. I have not yet had the privilege of saying it to you. I will say it now with all the respect that is due to a man of your age and to a man whose hand I am quite sure can do remarkable things to unguarded minds. But I will say it. The answer is no, and the answer was always going to be no. And you knew, in fact, when you packed your guard, that the answer was going to be no. And you came anyway with 20 of the longest old killers in the world standing behind you because you have, on the whole, made up your mind that if you cannot have me, you would prefer me dead, in which case I think we should stop pretending and get on with whatever you mean to do. There was a long silence. The smile on Arrow's face did not, by the end of the silence, mean what it had at the beginning. That is, he said very softly, "Regrettable?" "Yes, Jane." The small, pale girl at the center of the line stepped forward. She stepped, in fact, only by the breadth of 1 foot. She did not need more. She looked at Harry. Her eyes, pale red under colorless lashes, settled on his with a fixed weight and a single small fixed hatred. Harry felt, somewhere behind his collarbone, a small sharp white pain begin to start. It did not finish. He had spent, when Hermione had been not in the wood at all but on a long rainy afternoon in a Hogwarts classroom, the better part of 3 years training against Snape in the discipline of the keeping of the mind. He had, in his time, withstood the touch of Voldemort to his thoughts. He had, in his time, withstood worse. The pain in his collarbone gathered, met a thing in his ribs which had been arranged, with calm forethought, to receive it, slid off it the way water slid off oiled glass, and was gone. Jane's small face did the very smallest of frowns. She tried again. She tried harder. She tried, in fact, with all of the gift of her, which had been for 2 centuries a sufficient gift to bring small kings and large ones to their knees in the snow. The collarbone twinged. The ribs caught. The thing slid off. Harry very politely smiled at her. "Madam," he said, "I am sorry. It does not, I'm afraid, work on me." The small frown on her face broke into a small, unbridled hatred. "Alec." The small, pale boy at her side stepped forward. A gray mist began, very gently, to come out of the air around him. It was not exactly air. It was a thing like an absence of all sense, a kind of pewter slow blanket which moved across the air toward Harry the way a slow flood moves over a flat field. It would not, ordinarily, have been a thing with anything to fight. There was nothing to bite. There was no edge. Harry raised one hand, palm up. a small sun came gently into existence on his palm. The sun was, for perhaps the first time on Earth in 1800 years, actually a sun. He had not made a small fake light of the sort schoolboys made. He had, in advance, in front of Carlyle in the kitchen the previous day, worked out the precise mathematics of the thing. The sun on his palm was not, for any of the assembled people, dangerous. He had set the small specific scale of it at 3 steps removed from harm. It was, however, precisely the kind of light that was, in a very specific old way, fatal to a thing without form. The gray mist at the edge of his palm boiled in 3 seconds into nothing. Alex staggered. The small light went out of him. "Caius," Arrow said in a tone that was no longer mannered. Caius came forward. Caius did not bother with the gifts of the small ones. Caius came in the direct old way of his very old kind, in a single bound of the kind that, in the gray clearing 2 months earlier, would have ended a man named James. He came at Harry with the white, clean snarl of a man who was, in his way, a very old artist of murder. The boy on the porch, with the long pale wand in his right hand, made a small, almost tender gesture with the left. The lawn between Caius and the porch lifted into a kind of glass. Caius hit it at speed. The glass held. Caius's nose, his shoulder, his thigh, his right shin, all hit the glass and did not pass through. The glass had, where his face had hit, a small flower of impact that did not crack any further. Caius's face, his real, white, ancient, furious face, distorted against the glass, the way the face of a fish distorts when it presses itself against the glass of a small tank. "Caius," Harry said gently, "I am very sorry." He raised the long, pale wand. The glass between them slid in a small, careful, patient way like a sheet, sideways, past Caius. Caius's body, at speed, came through the now empty space onto the porch. He did not have time to shift his momentum. Harry, on the porch, did not move out of the way. He let Caius come. He stepped inside the bound onto Caius's right side. He laid the long, pale wand against Caius's throat. Caius, for the smallest fraction of a second, was still moving. Caius, for the next fraction of a second, was no longer moving. Caius, for the third fraction of a second, was in 3 pieces on the porch floor, and the long, pale wand had moved with the small, precise economy of an old swordsman's blade, and there was a thin, clean line of bright fire along the cut of his throat that ate, in 2 seconds, what remained. The third piece, which had been Caius's head, looked up briefly at Harry with the eyes of a man who was, against a great many centuries' worth of habit, surprised. It went still. The boards under it scorched. There was a single long beat in the clearing. Then everything moved. Felix and Santiago came up the slope at a run with the long, beautiful, coordinated speed of an old guard, and Emmett Cullen, who had been waiting, with a small private pleasure, for exactly this, met them in the gravel with the kind of meaty, unself-conscious enthusiasm that Emmett, alone in the family, was capable of. Rosalie, beside him, took Santiago by the wrist, the elbow, and the throat in 3 quick movements that her husband did not, in his private heart, ever let himself be properly impressed by because it would, he felt, embarrass him. Demetri came up the porch from the side and was met, halfway along the rail, by the great pewter wolf and a wolf with bracken-brown fur, and the big mottled gray one behind them. Heidi, at the rear, came round to the side of the house, and met in the gravel a thing she had not seen before, a small fast hawk shaped from a stone which, when she swatted at it, did not break, but instead fastened its small fast hawk teeth into her throat and flapped, with the patience of a stone pretending to be a hawk in her face. There were, very shortly, 20 of them. Jane and Alec, in the center of the line, faced Edward and Bella. Bella, who had refused, in a long, quiet kitchen conversation with Edward the previous afternoon, to be left in town, who was holding a small piece of cold iron that Harry had pressed into her hand and told her would, if she pointed it and willed it, become a kind of polite blast that would push a vampire 10 feet. And Bella, with white knuckles and the small composure of a girl who was learning in real time that she had more iron in her than she had previously known, lifted the iron in her hand and pointed it at the small, pale girl in the center of the line. She willed. A small, sharp white pulse came out of the iron and across the air, and Jane went, like a thrown coat, across the lawn into the cedars, and the small, specific pain in her face was, for the first time in 2 centuries, the small, specific pain of having, herself, had something done to her. Alec, beside her, opened his mouth in something like surprise. Edward took him in 2 breaths. Across the gravel, Arrow had not moved. He was watching Harry on the porch. The smile had left his face. The face under the smile was the face of a man who had, in his time, looked into the hearts of a great many people, and had been very rarely surprised, and was, in this moment, trying to decide whether he was or was not surprised, and whether, additionally, his ordinary plan of the last 1200 years, which was to be the cleverest thing in any room, was about to be, this once, insufficient. He came forward. He did not run. He came forward at a measured pace, with his hands open at his sides, the way a chess player comes forward to lay his king down. "Mr. Potter, Arrow, my brother, I am sorry, Arrow. He came at me, I know. I gave him a wall to stop on. He went through it. I know. I am sorry." "I know that too." Arrow stood now 3 yards from the porch. He was looking at Harry with the curious, careful, finally honest look of a man who had, by accident or by design, been allowed to see a thing. "Mr. Potter, I would not, I think, have believed you had not a sense of mercy. I have it. Will you spend it now? I will if you will leave, if I leave. If you take what is left of your wives and your guard and your brother in gray and you walk back down the gravel, and you get into your cars, and you do not, in this life, in the lives of any of us in this clearing, in the lives of our children, come back. I will, if you will agree to that, allow you to walk." Arrow looked at him a long, long second. He had not, Harry thought, expected the offer. "You have killed Caius." Caius was a man who had killed many. He was, in addition, in the act of attempting to kill me. "I do not, on the whole, regret his loss. I do not pretend to. You have killed Alec. You have, I think, broken Jane." "I have. You have, in fact, broken my guard." "Yes." "And you would let me, my wives, and Marcus walk down that gravel." "Yes." "Why?" Harry looked at him a long second, considering whether to say it. "Because Marcus," he said, "is tired." There was a small silence. Marcus, in his gray, raised his eyes from the gravel for perhaps the first time since they had stepped out of the cars. The eyes were red in the old Volturi way, but very faint. They had not been brightened by feeding for, perhaps, a year. He looked across the lawn at the boy on the porch. The boy with the small congregation of his unleft visible to Marcus alone, gathered in a quiet half-moon at his back, looked back. Marcus inclined his head. He inclined it, in fact, with a small, infinitesimal, slow grace, the way he had not inclined his head in 900 years. "Arrow," Marcus said quietly. "Brother, he has shown us mercy." "Yes, take it." There was, in Arrow's face, the small, terrible, private, internal moment of an emperor having a thing said to him by an old friend that he had not, at any point in the previous several centuries, expected to hear. "All right." Arrow said softly. "All right," Marcus said. Arrow turned. He gathered his wives, who had not, Harry now noticed, in fact participated. They had stood in their long, pale dresses at the back of the line, watching, with the still patient old practiced eyes of the women of long old houses. He laid a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Demetri," he said into the air. Demetri came. He limped. His face had gravel on it. His dignity had not entirely returned. "Master, we are leaving. Master, all of you," said Arrow, lifting his voice slightly in the long old voice that the surviving guard had been bred to obey. "We are leaving. We will not, on this matter, return." The guard, what was left of it, gathered. They did so without comment. Felix came down off Emmett's leg in pieces and was, with surprising small kindness, helped together by Renata. Santiago picked himself up out of the gravel with one arm hanging from a single thread of sinew at the shoulder and looked, mildly, displeased. The wolves on the slope did not move. The Cullens on the porch did not move. The boy with the long pale wand did not move. The Volturi went down the long gravel track. The cars started. The cars drove away. When the sound of them had finished, when the long, deep silence of the cedars had settled back over the clearing, when the small fires that had been on the boards of the porch had gone, very slowly out, Harry sat down on the top step of his porch and laid the long pale wand across his knees and put his face in his hands. He sat that way for a long time. The Cullens did not come closer. Esme came to the bottom of the steps and stood with her hand on the rail. Carlisle came and stood with her. Edward stayed where he was beside Bella, with one hand on her elbow, holding her up because she had begun, very gently, to shake. Harry sat. After a while he raised his head. There were tear tracks on his face. He had not noticed them go down. He wiped them with the heel of his hand in 2 quick movements. "Right," he said. "Right," said Carlisle. "That's done, then." "Yes, Harry?" Sam came down off the slope in his bare feet on the cold gravel. He came up the drive and stopped at the foot of the steps. He laid one hand on Harry's shoulder very briefly and took it away. The hand had not, in any meaningful sense, said anything. It had said everything. "Tell us," Sam said, "what to do with the bits. Burn them, all of them, even those, all right." The wolves, in their other shape, padded silently back up onto the property, and a small, careful work of disposal was, in the long, deep, wet silence of a Forks dawn, very thoroughly done. The rain came down all night. Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. A place to belong. Spring in Forks was a small, sly thing. It did not announce itself in the way spring did in other countries. There were no banks of daffodils in roadside ditches. There were no cherry trees in pink pageant. There were, instead, the small gestures of a wet country. The cedars putting on a fresh inch of new green at their tips, the moss on the fence posts brightening from gray to something that had half a memory of yellow in it. The long cold mist over the river thinning at its edges by perhaps a foot a week, and the low pewter sky over Main Street picking up, on its better afternoons, a strange blue tint at the seam where the cloud met the trees. It rained more often than it did not. It rained, however, more thoughtfully. It rained, by April, in a way that suggested it had been listening. Harry had begun, in the weeks after the Volturi, to think of Forks as his. He had not thought it the morning of the longest night of the year. He had thought then, alone on his porch, with the smell of cedar burning in the gravel beyond him, that he had merely defended a thing that had not, formally, become his yet. He had stood up off the porch step and gone inside and slept for a long time, and when he had woken, 3 days had gone, and there had been a stack of casseroles on his stove, and a small, careful fire in the hearth, and Esme Cullen, in his kitchen, in his apron, frying him a single egg. "Good morning, Esme. You will eat it." "I will eat it." "Good." He had eaten the egg. He had not, that morning, been able to ask her how long she had been there. She had not, in any case, told him. She had patted his shoulder and put a mug into his hand, and sat opposite him at his small table and waited, in the long, patient, kind way she had been built to do, for him to be a person again. He had been a person again, slowly, over the next several days. He had walked out into the cedars in the morning. He had walked along the line where his wards had been. He had let the wards down. He had laid out in a small, careful pattern in the wet ground behind the house a square of stones the size of a vegetable bed, and he had begun, in the hour after breakfast, to dig. He had been digging when Hermione's letter had come for 40 minutes. He had not made much progress. The ground was rooty. The letter, like the parcel of phoenix feather before it, had come by Muggle airmail. The handwriting on the envelope was not Hermione's. He had stood in the gravel by the leaning fence and turned the envelope over twice before he had recognized the handwriting as Ron's. Inside the envelope had been a single sheet of paper, folded twice with 3 short lines on it. "We are coming over for Easter. Hermione has bought the tickets. Don't make her cross." R below the lines in Hermione's hand. He insisted on writing it himself. "Sorry about the brevity. We will be at SeaTac on the 8th of April at 3 p.m. Pacific." Harry had laughed, all by himself, in his garden, with his hands on the handle of the spade and the small shoots of new green at the tips of the cedars over his head, for the first time in a long time. Bella, on the 3rd day of April, sat in his kitchen with a mug of tea and the kind of small, considering frown her mother had used to wear at the same age. "Harry, I want to ask you something." "All right. It's about the choice." He set down his mug. He had been, ever since the night of the longest night of the year, waiting for her to have this conversation. He had not pressed her. He had not, in fact, brought it up. He had been waiting for her to bring it. She had brought it on a wet Saturday morning in her father's flannel shirt with rain on her hair from the walk up the gravel. "All right," he said. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean. You think I shouldn't." "I do not, in fact, think that." "I do not, in fact, think anything about whether you should or shouldn't because it's not, on the whole, my call." He folded his hands around the warmth of the mug. "I will tell you, if it's useful, what I observe. You may not like all of it. You should know that I am, on your side, whatever your side ends up being. Tell me." "All right." He chose his words. "Edward loves you very much. I know. He also has a particular kind of fear of his own teeth. He is, in his way, a very Catholic man. He believes, at the bottom of his nature, that what he is wrong, and that you are saving him by being his wife, and that turning you would be the thing that uncovers, at the end, that he has been wrong all along, and he is, Bella. He is not entirely wrong about that. There is a real risk of that, not of being wrong, of feeling it in himself when it happens. He will, when he turns you, never be quite the same toward himself again. All right. That is a thing he has not said to you. No, he has not said it because he loves you. He thinks, on the whole, that the love is the more important fact. I am inclined to think, in a long view, that he is right." She blinked at him. "You are inclined to, in a long view? Carlyle won't even. Carlyle is older than Edward by 3 centuries. Carlyle has thought more carefully. Carlyle has, on the whole, decided that the moral question of whether to make another vampire is one he will, in his own life, leave alone, except in the very particular case of saving someone in the act of dying. He is not wrong, either. He has, however, the privilege of having found his peace. He is also, you may have noticed, a very lonely man underneath it." He paused. "I am not, Bella, going to tell you what to do. You're really not. I'm really not. I have spent, in fact, most of my life having men a great deal older than I am tell me what to do, and I have decided in my old age." She gave the small private snort she had begun lately to give whenever he said that I dislike the practice. "What would you do?" "I would not, in your place, become a vampire. That sounds like telling me what to do. It is what I would, in your place, do. I would, in your place, marry the man, take a good number of years with him, have what children I wanted to have, watch the seasons pass, write a few books or paint a few paintings or fix the porch on my father's house, and at the end of the 7th, the 8th decade, I would let go. I would do it, in fact, looking him in the eye. I would say with all my heart that I had loved him, and that I was glad to have done so, and that I was, on the whole, ready to move on. He would, you must understand, miss me, he would miss me in a way that would make the next century rough. He would also, at the end of that century, become a slightly larger person. I would prefer that. For who? For him. Eventually." She was quiet for a long time. "Harry, why are you telling me you wouldn't be a vampire? Because you asked? You have looked vampires in the eye. You have, in fact, killed 3 of them in this town. You don't think they are bad. They are not bad. I am not telling you not to do it because they are bad. I am telling you not to do it because you, Bella, are a very particular person. And the thing that I think makes you a particular person is that you are not, at the bottom of your nature, a person who would be made better by being made not to die. You are made better, in fact, by the fact that you will. You will, in the certain knowledge of your finitude, do extraordinary things. You will, freed of that knowledge, do, I am afraid, smaller ones." He shrugged. "I do not, in fact, think this for everyone. I think it for you. You think this." She said slowly, "For the master of death." "I think this," he said, "as the master of death." She looked at him over her tea for a long minute. "Harry, thank you. You haven't decided?" "No, I am not asking you to. You're a strange friend. I have been told that before." She drank her tea. Hermione and Ron came up the drive on the 8th of April with 2 small bags between them and the look of people who had, in the last 20 hours, been on 3 planes, 2 trains, and an extremely puzzled Muggle taxi. Ron, in particular, had the face of a man who had, in the last hour, attempted to operate an automatic door and lost the engagement. "Mate," Ron said. "Ron, you live here. I live here. It's wet, mate. It's wet. Properly wet. Properly wet, yes. I love it." said Hermione behind him with her face turned up to the cedars, and she did, you could see at once, mean it. The cedars over the house had a way of doing this to a particular kind of person. They stayed 3 days. Hermione spent the first afternoon in Carlisle's library, having, in advance, secured an invitation, and emerged at dinner time with a small notebook full of writing, and the small, wide, pleased eyes of a person whose week had been remade by access to a particular 16th-century Latin treatise. Ron spent the same afternoon in Harry's garden, helping Harry plant, in the small, careful square he had dug and redug 6 times since New Year, the 13 shoots of various vegetables Esme had insisted on bringing him from a greenhouse outside Port Angeles. Ron, who had grown up in a back garden in Devon with 7 brothers and 1 sister and a mother who fed all of them 3 meals a day on the proceeds of that garden, knew, it turned out, an extraordinary amount about cabbages. Harry. Did the doctor just say to me on his front step that he was 9 generations older than me on his mother's side? He may have. Bloody hell, mate. I know. How are you not? How are you walking around? How are you? It takes a few days. It is going to take me, said Ron. Longer than 3 days. I know. We'll come and see you instead next year, will you? I will. Ron rubbed his nose in his small, careful, unembarrassed way. All right, he said. On the second night, Hermione cornered Harry in the kitchen with a mug of tea and a small private smile. You're staying. I'm staying. You like it here. I like it here. You like that girl. I like Bella is not Hermione, that's sort of not as a girl, Harry, as a friend. As a small person you have decided to be careful with, I am not blind. Oh, I am pleased about it. I am pleased on the whole about it too. She put her hand on his. The country is settling, she said. It will be a few months, perhaps a few years. The cell is being broken up. Kingsley is in retirement, but he is, in his retirement, doing a great deal of useful work. The Auror office is being reorganized. The new minister is, well. The new minister is a problem we will, in time, solve. We have your back. You will not, I think, have to come home in a hurry. That is a relief, Hermione. It is a relief, yes, she smiled. Andromeda is doing well. She is, frankly, doing better than I had any right to expect. Teddy is amazing. Teddy is very small and very loud and very pink-haired. I want to meet him. You will. We will bring him at Christmas if he is travel fit, and you will be uncomfortable and he will get sick on your shoulder and you will, in fact, be very happy. I will, Harry, You are different. You have come back. You are not all the way back, but you are coming back. I know. You are allowed to come all the way back. I know. I love you, you stupid boy. I love you, Hermione. She put her arms around him briefly in the way of an older sister. On the 3rd day before they left, Ron and Harry walked down to the cliffs above the beach at La Push. It was a long, quiet afternoon. The sea was the slate kind of gray that the Pacific did when it had been in a thoughtful mood. It was the kind of slate that had pinpoints of silver in it, where the small turning waves caught the lights from the cloud. They sat on a long, flat rock above the long, flat sea and did not, for some time, say anything at all. Harry, It's beautiful here, mate, I know. It's stupidly beautiful. I know. Do you ever think about Fred? All the time, Ron, all the time. All the time, Ron, yes. There was a small silence on the long, flat rock. He'd have liked it here. He would. He'd have found a way to charm the salt water into shouting jokes at the surfers. He would absolutely have done that. Ron laughed softly with the small, cracked private laugh of a brother who had been, for almost a year, mostly not laughing. The laugh did not, on the whole, last very long. He wiped his nose with his sleeve. Harry, he said, take care of yourself, all right, eat properly. All right. Don't take on entire ancient governing bodies of vampires by yourself, all right. I'll try really hard, Harry. I will try really hard. I love you, mate. I love you, Ron. They watched the sea a long time. Hermione and Ron went home on the evening of the 11th of April in a Muggle taxi to SeaTac, with 2 small bags and the flushed, pleased, exhausted faces of people who had been, after a long winter, somewhere good. Harry waved them off at the porch in the rain. He stood for some time after the taillights of the taxi had gone down the long gravel on his porch with his hand on the rail behind him. The screen door opened. Carlyle came out and stood beside him. They are good to you. They are. Will they come again? Yes, and the boy? Teddy. At Christmas, Andromeda will bring him over. That will be lovely. It will. There was a long quiet. Harry, Carlyle said after a while, There is something I have been wanting to say. Yes, you, when the matter with Arrow, when he had finished. When he was looking at you and Marcus said what he said. Arrow turned at that point to leave. Yes, you did not see, perhaps, what Marcus did just before he turned. What did he do? He bowed to you. I do not, on the whole, expect any of us to remember a thing the second oldest Volturi has bowed to in our lifetimes. I have not. Oh, Harry said, he has since abdicated. Has he? I had a letter from a friend in Volterra last week. Arrow is somewhat reduced. He no longer travels. He has, in fact, locked himself in his chambers for some time. The wives are, I think, a little pleased to be rid of him. Marcus has gone apparently to a small monastery on the Adriatic. He is, by all accounts, painting. He is, by all accounts, content. That is, in fact, a relief. It is. Will more of them come? Some of them, in time, will. They will come, on the whole, more carefully. All right. Harry, you have done here an enormous thing. I have killed 3 people. You have. I do not feel, on the whole, that an enormous thing was done. I know that you don't. That is, in fact, the good news. The enormous thing was the part that came after. Carlyle laid his hand very lightly on Harry's. The hand was cold. You stayed, you let on the porch men whose hearts had been in their teeth for centuries walk down off your gravel. You did not, in your moment of greatest power, take the kind of pleasure a man your age is entitled to take. You will, I think, be remembered for this. I would prefer not to be remembered. I know, Carlyle, is Esme making lasagna? She is, in fact, making lasagna. All right. Harry sighed. I will eat the lasagna. You will eat the lasagna. There was a small evening party at the Cullens that night. Bella was there. Charlie Swan was there, too, brought up the long drive in his uniform on his way home from a swing shift, with the slightly suspicious face of a man who knew he was being indulged and did not, on the whole, mind. Sam Uli and Emily came up from La Push with Jacob in tow, and he had grown in that season 3 full inches and was, when seen sideways in the long mirror in the hallway, the height of his father. Esme made lasagna. The lasagna was, perhaps for the first time in her century of practicing, actually good. Charlie ate his serving in silence and rose, awkwardly, to make a small speech he had not, until that moment, planned. He cleared his throat. I just want to say, on behalf of myself, and on behalf of my daughter, and on behalf of, frankly, this whole damn town, which I serve and which I, on the whole, like, that we are glad you all are here. I do not, on the whole, know what's been going on in the woods these last few months. I am, on the whole, smart enough not to ask. I would just like to say formally, on behalf of the Forks Police Department, thank you, to all of you. To you, Carlyle, who has, twice in my life, sewed up a deputy. To you, Sam, who's keeping an eye on my daughter when she goes down to the beach. To you, Harry, who fixed my porch. I am, on the whole, glad of all of you. He sat down. He turned, very slightly red. Bella beside him leaned over and kissed his ear. Late, when the wolves had gone home and Charlie had gone home and Bella was asleep on a couch with Edward's coat over her, Harry stood at the long, pale glass of the Cullen great room with a cup of tea and looked out at the cedars in the dark. Carlyle came up beside him. What are you thinking, Harry? I am thinking, Harry said, about a thing my godfather said to me in a hallway in a house in London when I was 14 and angry. Yes, he said, the world is not split into good people and Death Eaters. The world has good and bad in it. We've all of us got light and dark inside. What matters is the part we choose to act on. That's who we really are. That is a wise godfather. It is. Did you think of it because of the Volturi? I thought of it, on the whole, because of me. He drank his tea. I have done in my life a great many things. I have done, on the whole, the right thing more often than not. I have, however, occasionally done it, Carlyle, by means I am not, in the long view, proud of. I have occasionally allowed the quickness of my temper to do the work for me. I am, finally, old enough to notice. I would like, in this country, in the rest of my life, to do better. Carlyle considered him. Harry, you will. How can you know? Because you said it. People who do better do not, generally, talk about doing better. They simply do better. People who say it, he smiled. People who say it are people who are about to make the small, daily, uncomfortable choices that make the saying come true. I have lived a long time. I have, in fact, said it a few times myself. I know what comes after. Thank you, Carlyle. Thank you. At 3 in the morning, Harry walked home through the cedars on foot. He had refused a ride. He liked, particularly, the long, deep dark of the highway in early spring. He liked the way the rain felt on his face after a long evening of warm rooms. He liked the small, specific sound of his own boots on the wet gravel. He came up the long track to his little house with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders down. He stopped at the leaning split-rail fence at the bottom of the drive and looked up at the small square shape of the house he had, by now, made his. There was a light burning in the front window. He had not, on the whole, left a light burning. He laid his hand on the fence post, which was, he noted with affectionate amusement, sound where he had set it last week, and he stood for a moment in the dark. Then he walked up the gravel. He came up the steps. He pushed the screen door open. In the cracked leather chair by the window, Andromeda Tonks was sitting in a long travel coat with her hair down on her shoulders and a small wrapped bundle in her lap. Her face was older than he remembered. There had been, in the last year, the kind of work the year had been. Her eyes were, however, the same. She did not stand up, Andromeda. Harry? You weren't. I was, in fact, due at Christmas. Yes, I came earlier. Your friend, the lady from the bank, the senior investigator, Green, wrote to me a fortnight ago to say it would be, on the whole, all right if I came. I did not want to wait, Andromeda. Yes, Harry. He came forward. He knelt by her chair. He laid his hand very gently on the small wrapped bundle. The bundle moved in its sleep in a small, comfortable way that small bundles, by their nature, did. The bundle had a wisp of soft, light hair coming out of the top of its blanket. The wisp of hair, as Harry watched, turned slowly from a sandy pale brown to a soft, thoughtful pink to a confident, decided turquoise. He laughed. The laugh came up out of him in a way he had not been laughing in a year. The laugh had in it no small congregation of his unleft, no battle, no porch full of ash. The laugh had in it a small, sleeping, blanket-bound child with hair that did not know what color it wanted to be. The laugh had in it everything that was about to come. "Hello, Teddy," he said. The child turned its small face into the curve of Andromeda's elbow and slept on. The rain came down all night. In the morning, the cedars dripped. The mist came up off the river at the Kallawa and went away by 10. The light over Forks was the absurd, ridiculous blue of a Pacific spring morning, blue all the way to the bone, scrubbed clean by a long, quiet rain. The garden at the back of the house had, in the night, sent up its first small tip of green. In the kitchen, Andromeda set a kettle on. In the cracked leather chair, the small bundle stirred. On the porch, Harry Potter, late of Britain, late of the Battle of Hogwarts, late of every name a country had ever pinned on him, stood with his hands open on the rail, and his face turned up into the sun, and he thought, with a small, almost amused, almost surprised quiet in his chest, "I am home." He went inside. He closed the door behind him. The rain came down all morning.